Good morning. Welcome to this board meeting of the National Transportation Safety Board, which, due to the COVID-19 virus, we are conducting virtually. I'm Robert Sumwalt. I'm honored to serve as the chairman of the NTSB. And joining us today are my colleagues on the board. And in just a few minutes, I'll ask them to each introduce themselves. But we have with us the Vice Chairman, Bruce Landsberg, Member Jennifer Hamady, Member Michael Graham, and Member Tom Chapman. Today, we meet in open session as required by the government and the Sunshine Act to consider the sinking of the amphibious passenger stretch duck vessel in Table Rock Lake near Branson, Missouri on July the 19th, 2016. On that day, the National Weather Service had issued a severe thunderstorm watch for the area, followed by a severe thunderstorm warning about 36 minutes before the sinking. The 33-foot amphibious vessel was one of 4 duck boats that operated on Table Rock Lake after the warning was issued. The manager on duty for Ride the Ducks Branson advised the captain and driver of Stretch Duck 7 to complete the lake portion of the tour before the land tour, which usually came first. About 5 minutes after entering the water, Stretch Duck 7 encountered the leading edge of a derecho, which generated 3 to 5 foot waves and wind gusts up to 73 miles per hour. The vessel sank about 250 feet from the exit ramp that it had been working its way toward, near the stern of the paddle wheeler Showboat Branson Belle. Of the 33 people on board, tragically, 17 lost their lives in the sinking. 6 others were injured, 2 of them seriously. On behalf of all of my colleagues at the NTSB, we'd like to offer our sincere condolences to the family and friends of all of those who've been affected by this tragedy. Clearly, the entire reason that we are here today is to prevent future tragedies. As widely reported in relation to this sinking, in 1999, the duck boat Miss Majestic sank in Arkansas, taking the lives of 13 of the 21 persons on board. There were many similarities between that sinking and the one that we are considering today. The NTSB issued several recommendations in connection with the sinking of the Miss Majestic that were never acceptably acted upon. And last year, after the sinking of Stretch Duck 7, we issued recommendations which, if acted upon, will address safety issues that were present in both accidents. We recommended that the U.S. Coast Guard require sufficient reserve buoyancy in modified duck boats, and that the Coast Guard also require the removal of canopies and side curtains before waterborne operations for those vessels without sufficient reserve buoyancy. These recommendations are important for making certain that the vessels themselves are safe to operate. Today, we'll discuss other vessel factors, but we will also turn to the cause of the sinking, which goes beyond only the vessels, to include human decision-making regarding their operation. We'll explore the actions and decisions of Ride the Ducks employees on the day of the sinking. Was there some reasoning that made it appropriate to take these 4 vessels, packed with tourists, onto a lake under a severe thunderstorm warning? And if not, did Ride the Ducks have a policy to appropriately guide employee decision-making? As to the vessel, the Duck's spring-loaded forward hatch allowed water to enter the vessel as the captain attempted to reach shore. And in the course of the investigation, it also became clear that the donning of life jackets in the presence of a fixed canopy could have made a terrible situation even worse. We will discuss this issue as well. In today's meeting, The staff will lay out the pertinent facts and analysis found in the draft report. They will present the draft findings, a probable cause, and recommendations to the board. And then we on the board will question the staff to ensure that the report, as we adopt it today, truly provides the best opportunity to enhance safety. The public docket for this investigation contains almost 4,000 pages of additional relevant material, and it's available on our website, which is www.ntsb.gov. The report on the sinking, the very report that we will adopt today, will also become available on that same webpage once it's been finalized and formatted. At this time, I'd like for each of my colleagues on the board to introduce themselves, beginning with Vice Chairman Landsberg. Good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Vice Chairman Landsberg here, and I'm looking forward to today's meeting. I hope we will have some really positive deliberations out of this that can move this forward.
Thank you very much. Member Hamady, good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, and good morning to my fellow board members, and a special good morning to the staff. I want to thank you for all your work on this investigation and the draft report, and I look forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Member Hamady. It's good to see you. Member Graham.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, fellow board members, and good morning, staff. I want to thank the staff for the hard work that they did on this investigation.
Thank you, Member Graham. Member Chapman.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. I'm pleased to be here this morning and pleased to have an opportunity to participate. I hope everyone is safe and well.
Well, thank you. It's we're all spread out across the country, staying safe, and it's good to see each of you. Thank you. Before I turn it over to the Managing Director, I would like to thank everyone who has made today's virtual board meeting from a technical perspective from making that possible. Clearly, it's been quite a journey for us to learn how to do this. I'll now recognize the Managing Director, Sharon Bryson, who will introduce the investigative and support staff who will be participating in this morning's board meeting.
Thank you, Chairman Sumwalt. I would like to also thank everyone who helped make this virtual board meeting happen today. It was a team effort involving multiple staff members representing a range of offices across the agency. My only administrative announcement this morning is a reminder for the meeting participants to silence all their electronic devices at this time. Now I will introduce the staff for today's meeting. The staff investigating this accident: Brian Young, the investigator in charge; Marcel Muse, Operations and Response Group Chairman; Michael Carr, Survival Factors Group Chairman; Mike Richards from our Office of Aviation Safety, the Meteorology Group Chairman; Nicole Ashby, the Writer-Editor; Morgan Terrell, our Acting Director in the Office of Marine Safety; Liam LaRue, Chief of Investigations for the Office of Marine Safety; Rob Jones, the Deputy Chief of Investigations for the Office of Marine Safety; Eric Stolzenberg, Chief of Product Development for Marine Safety; Kathy Silba, our General Counsel; Jim Ritter, the Director of the Office of Research and Engineering; Sean Payne, Recorder Specialist, the Office of Research and Engineering; Jeff Marcus, the Chief of Safety Recommendations Division in our Office of Safety Recommendations and Communications; and Mary Pat McKay, Chief Medical Officer in the Office of Research and Engineering. I'll now turn this over to Brian Young for the first presentation.
Thank you, Ms. Bryson. Good morning, Chairman Sumwalt and board members. I will be providing an overview of the events that took place on July 19, 2018 on Table Rock Lake, where the amphibious passenger vessel Stretch Duck 7 sank during a severe weather event. After being notified of this accident, Member Earl Lehner and NTSB staff arrived on scene the following day. Investigators and staff from these offices assisted with the on-scene investigation and the development of the draft report. I would like to acknowledge the staff noted here and on the next slide for their work on scene and throughout the report's development. I would also like to acknowledge the staff noted here for their work to produce this virtual board meeting. The parties to this investigation are listed here, and we would like to thank them all for their assistance on scene and throughout the entire investigation. Stretch Duck 7 was originally built in 1944 as an amphibious vehicle for military use during World War II and was converted later for commercial service. General Motors Corporation manufactured more than 21,000 of these vessels, which were designed as landing crafts to transport troops and cargo ashore. These vessels had no internal subdivision, except for minor structural interferences such as tunnels and hull stiffeners, and their internal hull was open. These vehicles are able to operate on land and in the water, and were known as duck boats due to the acronym DUKW. D indicated the model year of 1942, U referred to the utility body style, K for all-wheel drive, and W for dual rear axles. Several versions of amphibious duck vessels. The original, or fleet ducks, were about 31 feet long. In the mid-1990s, some of these vessels were lengthened and a captain's station was moved forward. This version of duck vessels were referred to as stretch ducks. The Stretch Duck 7 had a length of 33 feet, a beam of 8 feet, and a draft just over 5 feet. The next version of duck vessels was called a master jig version. These were built with a higher gunnel, which at the upper edges of the vessel's sides, a wider beam, and had increased buoyancy. The latest model of this type of amphibious vessel was called a truck duck. This vessel had no original World War II parts, had similar dimensions to a master jig version, and had a diesel engine. Stretch Duck 7 was operated as a passenger vessel and was certificated to carry a maximum of 38 passengers. It had a captain's station forward of the passenger compartment. A fixed vinyl canopy was installed above the passenger compartment, and 2 clear vinyl curtains on a spool could be electrically lowered to the closed position, and both could be released from the vessel in an emergency. Passengers entered and exited from the rear of the vessel. At the time of the accident, Stretch Duck 7 was being operated by Ripley Entertainment Incorporated, doing business as Ride the Ducks Branson. The company operated over 20 amphibious vessels in Branson, Missouri. Several times a day, the duck boats departed a facility in downtown Branson referred to as the Duck Dock. An aerial view of the facility is shown on the left, with a photo of some of the vessels in its fleet on the right. The duck boats typically toured the area on local roads, including Baird Mountain, then conducted about a 20-minute waterborne tour on Table Rock Lake, and then returned to the Branson facility. I will now discuss the events that took place on the day of the accident. On July 19th, 2018, the National Weather Service issued a severe thunderstorm watch at 11:20, indicating that the weather could impact the duck boat operating area late afternoon to early evening. Just before passengers started to board the vessel for the 1830 tour, the manager on duty from the duck dock advised the captain to head to the lake first, meaning he was to skip the tour of Baird Mountain and head directly to the lake instead. At 1828, passengers began boarding the Stretch Duck 7. At 1832, the National Weather Service issued a severe thunderstorm warning, advising of 60-mile-an-hour winds in the area of Table Rock Lake. A minute later, Stretch Duck 7 departed the boarding dock with 31 people aboard, a captain, a driver, and 29 passengers, ranging in ages from 1 to 70 years old. Stretch Duck 7 entered Table Rock Lake at 18:55. Stretch Duck 54 had entered the lake less than 2 minutes earlier, and 2 other duck boats were near the end of the water tour and both exited around 1900. The picture on the screen, taken by a passenger, shows the condition of a lake a few seconds after Stretch Duck 7 entered. On a typical tour, the duck boats entered the lake from the entry ramp, transited about 1,000 feet into the lake, around an island known as Duck Island, and then turned towards the exit ramp, passing the Showboat Branson Bell when it was moored at its facility. As the weather started to deteriorate on the evening of the accident, the captains of both Stretch Duck 7 and Stretch Duck 54 shortened their tours and headed directly for the exit ramp. On the screen, the track of the Stretch Duck 54 is seen in yellow on our map. This information was obtained from the vessel's GPS. The estimated track line of Stretch Duck 7 is seen in red and was calculated by NTSB using video analysis, since GPS data was not retrievable. The red triangle marks the location where the Stretch Duck 7 sank, just astern of their showboat Branson Belle. Just after 1900, the wind rapidly increased, building 3 to 5 foot winds from the north. Both captains closed their side curtains, and bilge alarms were heard on both duck boat vessels about 4 minutes after the wind speed increased. This photo was taken by a passenger aboard Stretch Duck 7 about this time. Both vessels headed for the exit ramp. The Stretch Duck 54 exited the lake at about 1907. The Stretch Duck 7 took on water, began listing to starboard, and sank about 1908. There were 17 fatalities and 6 injuries. The diagram on the screen depicts the seating arrangement on the evening of the accident. The figures are color-coded according to the level of injury. Red indicates fatalities, yellow, serious injuries, light gray, minor injuries, and dark gray, no injuries sustained. 4 days after the sinking, the Stretch Duck 7 was salvaged from Table Rock Lake from a depth of 85 feet and transported to a secure facility for inspection. The NTSB has investigated other accidents involving amphibious vessels. In particular, the Miss Majestic, which sank in Lake Hamilton near Hot Springs, Arkansas in 1999. Pictured is the Miss Majestic, which was salvaged in this photo. 13 passengers lost their lives when the Miss Majestic rapidly sank during a tour. The NTSB issued recommendations concerning reserve buoyancy and canopies, but these recommendations were not acted on. As a result of the Miss Majestic and Stretch Duck 7 sinkings, NTSB issued new recommendations in November of 2019 regarding reserve buoyancy, canopies, and side curtains. The safety issues that were identified in this accident, the sinking of Stretch Duck 7, were company oversight, engine compartment ventilation closures, reserve buoyancy, survivability, and Coast Guard oversight. Throughout the investigation, staff concluded that Stretch Duck 7's propulsion, steering, bilge system were not factors in the accident. Likewise, neither alcohol nor other impairing drugs were factors in the accident. This completes my presentation. At this time, the Meteorology Group Chairman, Michael Richards, will make his presentation.
Good morning, Chairman Sumwalt and board members. I will be discussing the weather system that impacted Table Rock Lake on July 19th, 2018. The storm system that ultimately impacted Stretch Duck 7 first developed about 7.5 hours prior to the accident time, about 400 miles away from the accident location. This mosaic of radar images in time depicts the progression of the storm that impacted Stretch Duck 7 from near its inception in northern Kansas, through Missouri, and into northern Arkansas. A severe thunderstorm watch is issued when thunderstorms producing hail 1 inch or larger in diameter and/or winds equal to or exceeding 58 miles per hour are possible. A watch was issued at 11:20 a.m. on the accident day for the accident area that described potential winds up to 75 miles per hour, scattered large hail, and tornadoes possible. A severe thunderstorm warning is issued when the watch issuance criteria are imminent or occurring. At 6:32 p.m., which was about 30 minutes prior to the accident, a warning was issued for the accident area. This warning advised of 60-mile-per-hour wind gusts and specifically named Branson and Table Rock Lake as locations impacted. High winds first began impacting the accident location along a well-defined outflow boundary, seen here in this weather radar image from about 7 minutes prior to the accident time. The maximum wind gust reported near the accident site was 73 miles per hour observed about the accident time, as reported by an unofficial source. This image presents the radar depiction from the Ride the Ducks weather information vendor used primarily by the operator, and depicts conditions from about 5 minutes before the accident time. Staff believes on the day of the accident, the National Weather Service accurately forecasted and issued timely notifications of a severe thunderstorm that would impact the accident location. This completes my presentation. At this time, the Nautical Operations Group Chairman, Marcel Muse, will make his presentation.
Good morning, Chairman Sumwalt and board members. The Operations Group presentation will cover the company's weather monitoring, water entry procedures, company's actions, and the captain's actions. Given the accurate forecast and the availability of weather information, investigators sought to understand why the company did not suspend water operations as the storm approached. Ride the Duck's primary source of weather information was a web-based weather application called Streamer RT. Pictured is a screenshot of the display on the monitor in Ride the Duck's lounge taken 2 days after the accident. Although investigators were unable to interview him, the manager on duty was aware of the threat of inclement weather, as evidenced by his decision to have the captain of Stretch Duck 7 complete the water portion of the tour first. Investigators confirmed that email alerts were sent to the company personnel for the severe thunderstorm warning at 1832 and for an observation of lightning at 1849, although we were unable to confirm whether those emails were opened. Sufficient information was available regarding the anticipated intensity and timing of the approaching storm through various means, including the broadcasted severe thunderstorm watch and warning, local media, and in-house software alerts. 3 duck boats were on the road at 1832 when the warning was issued, advising of thunderstorms moving at 50 miles per hour with wind gusts of 60 miles per hour. Stretch Duck 7 departed a minute later. The image above shows the timing of all 4 duck boats operating that evening. The red highlighted section indicates the period of the severe thunderstorm warning. Despite the available information, Ride the Ducks allowed 4 of its vessels to enter the water in close proximity to the approaching weather. Staff believes that Ride the Ducks did not effectively use all available weather information to monitor the approaching severe weather, nor assess the risk it posed to their waterborne operation. Coast Guard restrictions on the certificate of inspection prohibited Ride the Duck vessels from operating in winds over 35 miles per hour or in winds greater than 2 feet. Given that a severe thunderstorm watch was in effect all afternoon, active monitoring of the weather would have been prudent. More consideration should have been given to the weather forecasted to exceed the safe limits of the duck boats. Staff believes Ride the Ducks should have suspended waterborne operations for Stretch Duck 7 and the other last tours of the day in anticipation of the imminent severe weather. The 2012 Operations Manual, the Certificate of Inspection, and the Stability Letter all define maximum parameters that duck boats could operate in on the water. Company guidance also instructed captains not to enter the water when lightning was present, in low visibility, with any mechanical issues, or when severe weather was approaching. Severe weather however, was not defined, and how close or how fast it was approaching was not further discussed. Having established well-defined parameters would relieve the manager on duty and captains from making subjective decisions about when to continue the tours. Staff therefore believes that Ride the Ducks should have had specific guidance for the operations team to determine when to suspend waterborne operations due to approaching severe weather. Procedures that strictly delineate conditions under which vessels will be allowed to operate are frequently referred to as go, no go specifications. Staff proposes a recommendation to address this issue. Stretch Duck 7's captain had been instructed to complete the water portion of the tour first, rather than the road tour. Therefore, management assumed there was time to enter and exit the water before the storm's arrival. There was no further communication between management and Stretch Duck 7. Duck boat crews all told investigators they found Table Rock Lake calm with light winds. None of the 3 other boats on the water relate any weather-related issues to Stretch Duck 7. One of these boats was captained by Ride the Duck's general manager. Despite being aware of oncoming weather that he observed on the weather radar before leaving, Stretch Duck 7's captain was not aware of the storm's intensity or how fast it was approaching. Thus, there was no indication he should not enter the lake. Based on the manager on duty's orders to go to the lake first, the captain's visual assessment of the conditions from the entry ramp, the weather at the time, the presence of other duck boats on the water, and his previous operating experience. Based on the information available to the captain of Stretch Duck 7, staff believes that it is likely the captain believed he could safely complete the waterborne portion of the tour before the thunderstorm arrived. Per the company's operations manual and crew training, captains were instructed to head to shore and exit the water for any abnormal situations. Stretch Duck 7's captain recognized the approaching weather at about 1900, and he turned north towards the exit ramp instead of following the normal route around Duck Island. Company procedures directed captains to keep the bow into the waves in these conditions. Had he attempted to return to the entrance ramp, the seas would have been on the vessel's beam, where there was less freeboard, and the vessel would have been subject to more wind heel. Therefore, staff believes the captain's decision to head towards the exit ramp when encountering the severe weather was appropriate. Though Ride the Duck's in-house weather training for new captains was more thorough than the Coast Guard mandated training, the NAVIC and the operations manual were missing detailed procedures and training requirements for weather monitoring and how to make go-no-go decisions. Given the operational restrictions on duck boats related to wind and wave conditions, staff believes additional weather-related training may be justified for operators and for deck officers. Mariners with Rivers endorsements would benefit from a better understanding of weather products. Further, these mariners should be competent in assessing information from the National Weather Service and commercial weather providers, recognizing weather hazards, assessing risks, and implementing controls that would prevent vulnerable vessels and passengers from being exposed to danger. Staff has proposed a recommendation in this area. This completes my presentation. The investigator in charge and engineering group chairman, Brian Young, will now discuss the sinking sequence.
Good morning. The following slides will describe the events leading up to the sinking of Stretch Duck 7 on the evening of July 19, 2018. I will start by discussing the engine compartment ventilation openings of the Stretch Duck 7. The picture on the left is a view from above of the Stretch Duck 7's bow area. The forward bow hatch is in the foreground of the picture and was equipped with a spring-loaded damper that could be closed from the captain's station, in which it would be held upward by spring tension. The engine compartment cover, or hood, is located just forward of the windshield and was able to be dropped closed from the captain's station as well. The diagram on the right shows the air intake and exhaust openings to the engine compartment for Stretch Duck 7. It includes the forward bow hatch, the engine compartment hood, and the exhaust openings to the engine compartment. As seen on the DVR, the engine compartment hood had been closed by the captain on the onset of severe weather. After inspecting the salvage vessel, the side air discharge vents were found in the open position, and the spring-loaded hatch on the bow was found in the closed position, being held upward by spring tension. The next several slides will display video clips from a witness cell phone minutes after the Stretch Duck 7 encountered severe weather. This footage may be upsetting to some audience members who are viewing this proceeding. I will pause for a moment to allow those who prefer not to view the series of videos to temporarily look away from the display before we continue. This video clip, taken by a passenger aboard the showboat Branson Belle, shows the Stretch Duck 7 about 3.5 minutes after being exposed to severe weather. As the Stretch Duck 7 is moving on the lake through the storm, waves are visible rolling over the bow. This next video clip shows the Stretch Duck 7 at about 19:04, just 4 minutes after being exposed to severe weather. The vessel's bow is seen crashing into the oncoming waves, and the water from the lake continues to roll onto and over the bow. This video clip shows a Stretch Duck 7 about 5 minutes after being exposed to severe weather. Both the Stretch Duck 7 and the Stretch Duck 54 are visible in this video clip. The Stretch Duck 54 is visible in the foreground closer to the camera, and the Stretch Duck 7 is located further out in the lake. This video clip shows a Stretch Duck 7 about 7 minutes after being exposed to severe weather. The vessel is setting lower in the water, and the bow dips below the surface of the lake with nearly every wave it encounters. The logo on the starboard side is completely submerged. This final video clip captures the Stretch Duck 7 about 8 minutes after being exposed to severe weather. The vessel's bow is submerged underwater, and it has a starboard list. Staff believes that the initial water ingress to the Stretch Duck 7 was likely from waves rolling over the air intake hatch's spring-loaded damper, intermittently opening it, thereby allowing water into the engine compartment. Staff has proposed recommendations to the Coast Guard and to Ripley Entertainment to address this issue. This concludes the video playback, and the engineering presentation will resume at this time. The Stretch Duck 7 was exposed for several minutes to 3 to 5 foot waves and winds over 70 miles an hour, resulting in waves intermittently flooding through the bow hatch and into the engine compartment. This initial flooding trimmed the vessel down by the bow. The Stretch Duck 7 did not have any compartmentalization or subdivision that would have contained the floodwater into this compartment. As the Stretch Duck 7 continued to head into the wind and waves, its pitching motion allowed water accumulating in the engine compartment to travel aft through the length of the vessel. With the rate of flooding exceeding the capacity of the bilge pumps, Stretch Duck 7 began listing to starboard, and water began filling the passenger compartment. As the vessel's reserve buoyancy was overcome by the weight of the floodwater inside, its freeboard was quickly reduced. As witness video revealed, this allowed additional flooding through the side air discharge ducts by the captain station and beneath the side curtains, over the gunnels, and into the passenger space, swamping and rapidly sinking the vessel by the stern in seconds. Staff believes that rapid sinking of the Stretch Duck 7 resulted from uncontrolled progressive flooding due to a lack of subdivision. The NTSB has been concerned with the lack of sufficient reserve buoyancy of these vessels since the 1999 sinking of the Miss Majestic, another DUKW vessel that also had no subdivision or flotation. This Miss Majestic flooded progressively from a relatively small gap at the drive shaft below the waterline. Once it flooded, the vessel rapidly sank, leaving little opportunity for passengers to escape, resulting in 13 fatalities. As a result of the Miss Majestic sinking, the NTSB issued safety recommendations to the Coast Guard, one of which recommended that reserve buoyancy be provided in these type of amphibious vessels through passive means, such as watertight compartmentalization, built-in flotation, or equivalent measures. In 2002, the Coast Guard replied that it did not concur with the recommendation, indicating its belief that sufficient requirements were in place. Staff believes that had the Coast Guard implemented the NTSB's 2002 recommendation requiring sufficient reserve buoyancy through passive means, the Stretch Duck 7 likely would not have sank. Investigators sought to understand why the captain of the Stretch Duck 54 was able to exit the lake despite experiencing the same condition as the captain of the nearby Stretch Duck 7. The Stretch Duck 54 was a master jig version, which was designed with a 6-inch wider beam, which increased the vessel's displacement slightly and increased reserve buoyancy relative to the earlier version of the Stretch Duck vessel. Additionally, the master jig models had about a 6-inch higher gunnel. Similarly loaded, the Stretch Duck 54 had a higher freeboard than the Stretch Duck 7 and sat higher in the water. This higher bow would have reduced the amount of water rolling across it during severe weather. Thus, the Stretch Duck 54's higher freeboard and larger reserve buoyancy would have required a greater volume of floodwater and therefore a longer period of time to swamp the vessel over the gunnel. Moreover, the Stretch Duck 54 was equipped with a hinged solid steel cover over the forward air intake hatch, which was held closed in a down position with 2 fasteners, rather than the spring-loaded damper on the Stretch Duck 7 that could not be secured. The fixed air intake hatch cover on the bow of the Stretch Duck 54 prevented waves on the bow from flooding down into the engine compartment, as they likely did on Stretch Duck 7. Staff believes that the Stretch Duck 54 was able to exit the lake while being exposed to the same conditions as Stretch Duck 7 due to the increased freeboard, greater reserve buoyancy, and a securable bow hatch that prevented the ingress of water. This completes my presentation. The next presentation will be from the Survival Factors Group Chairman, Michael Carr.
Good morning, Chairman Sumwalt and board members. The Survival Factors presentation will cover installed side curtains, donning life jackets, horizontal and vertical escape, Coast Guard Navigation and Vessel Inspection Circular 101, guidance for operations during approaching weather, and its guidance regarding egress during a rapid sinking. And during the presentation, I will refer to the Navigation and Vessel Inspection Circular 101 as NAVIC 101. Open amphibious passenger vessels fitted with canopies may be outfitted with side curtains. Side curtains can be an impediment to passenger egress during an abandonment of a vessel. As seen in the image, both Stretch Duck 7 and Stretch Duck 54 had the curtains down as they attempted to exit the lake. When closed, the curtains obstruct the over-the-side escape route to be used by the passengers. The Stretch Duck 7 was equipped with side curtains that were fitted with a means for the captain to electrically lower them and raise them. Additionally, the captain could release them during an emergency. The Stretch Duck 7 captain released the port side curtain just before the vessel sank. And because the vessel sank so quickly, he was not able to release the starboard side curtain. With the starboard side curtain closed as the vessel began sinking by the stern, the closest over-the-side escape was blocked for passengers on the starboard side. Once the vessel was submerged, escape was possible only through the port side where the curtain was released, or by making one's way forward through the windshield, which had been opened by the force of the water. Staff believes that when the vessel sank, the closed starboard side curtain aboard the Stretch Duck 7 impeded egress and likely resulted in additional fatalities. Wearing life jackets prior to a vessel sinking is generally considered favorable for increasing survivability. However, as identified in the investigations into the Miss Majestic sinking, as well as the Lady D and Ethan Allen capsizings, donning life jackets while still inside an enclosed compartment can negatively impact survivability. As explained in the Lady D report, the buoyant safety device would have carried a wearer upward when most people had to swim downward to escape. The circumstances in the Stretch Duck 7 accident also indicate that donning a life jacket inside the rapidly sinking vessel would have resulted in the buoyant safety device pushing a person upward against the top of the enclosed space formed by the canopy and the closed side curtain. Wearing a life jacket would have impeded mobility, making it difficult, if not impossible, to exit through the windshield opening or on the port side where the curtain had been released, and likely would have delayed escape. This photo shows the recovered vessel. Note the lowered side curtain that blocked escape on the starboard side. Also shown are some of the 41 life jackets still connected to the vessel's canopy framing by their straps. Staff believes that donning life jackets on the Stretch Duck 7, while fitted with an overhead canopy, would have created an impediment to escape, would have increased the risk of persons being entrapped, and could have resulted in additional fatalities. Staff has proposed a recommendation to address this finding. Following the Miss Majestic accident, the NTSB recommended that the Coast Guard require the removal of canopies for waterborne operations, or installation of a Coast Guard approved canopy that does not restrict either the horizontal or the vertical escape of passengers in the event of sinking. The Coast Guard did not concur with this recommendation and did not take action. The Coast Guard told the NTSB in September 2002 that the NAVIC provided sufficient guidance. However, as demonstrated in this accident, emergency egress was still impeded by the canopy and a side curtain during the rapid sinking. This accident demonstrates a deficiency in the guidance and/or the application to the Stretch Duck 7. Staff believes that NAVIC 101 did not effectively address the NTSB's 2002 recommendation to require the removal of or Coast Guard approval of fixed canopies and consequently likely increase the number of fatalities. There are two other issues with the NAVIC. NAVIC 101 called for a company to have an operating manual that provides guidance on its operations to keep passengers safe. Companies like Ride the Ducks must use the NAVIC as a guide to create their operating manuals. However, the NAVIC does not address weather abort points. The yellow rectangle in the photo represents the threat area identified in the 1832 severe thunderstorm warning, which advised of 60-mile-per-hour gusts of wind that exceed the wind restriction on the certificate of inspection. Another concern is passengers being trapped. Because amphibious vessels lacking reserve buoyancy sink quickly, realistic guidance for emergency egress is needed to prevent passengers from being trapped in the vessel and still have access to life jackets. As found in the Miss Majestic and this accident, once it becomes apparent the vessel is in distress, a duck amphibious vessel sinks rapidly, not allowing time to prepare for or begin an organized abandonment. The circumstances found in the Stretch Duck 7 sinking has raised areas of concern regarding escape and waterborne operations with approaching severe weather that should be incorporated in an updated revision of the NAVIC. Staff believes NAVIC 101 does not account for circumstances found in the Stretch Duck 7 accident, including operations during approaching severe weather and emergency egress during rapid sinking, and should be updated to provide guidance accordingly. Staff has proposed a recommendation to address this finding. This completes my presentation. The response group chairman, Marcel Muse, will now make his presentation on the emergency response efforts.
My presentation will address the emergency response by Good Samaritans and first responders. Stretch Duck 7 sank just north and astern of the Showboat Branson Belle on the east shore of Table Rock Lake. The showboat was moored to a floating wharf that was connected to the shore by a floating walkway. On each side of the walkway, 2 stiff arms held the floating wharf in place. Most of the duckboat passengers surfaced astern of the Showboat Branson Belle and either drifted into the north stiff arm, downwind along the outboard side of the showboat, or south into the paddle wheels. In storm-force winds and heavy rain, the crew and passengers of the Showboat Branson Belle lifted victims from the water. Some survivors climbed onto the stop paddle wheel themselves or were assisted by showboat crew who climbed down. None of the 4 passengers that drifted down the outboard side of the showboat survived. On board the showboat, crew members assisted survivors with first aid and dry clothing. At least 4 passengers received CPR after being recovered from the water. All of the survivors were pulled from the water before first responders arrived. Therefore, staff believes the actions of the crew and passengers of the Showboat Branson Belle prevented more fatalities. The first call to 911 was at 1908 from a Showboat Branson Belle crew member. Firefighters were on scene by 1925, arriving by both water and land. They were followed closely by other agencies, despite other derecho-related incidents throughout the area. Only 14 of the 31 persons aboard the Stretch Duck 7 survived the sinking. While searching for more survivors, responders sorted the passengers and accurately and quickly triaged and transported 7 of the 14 survivors. Staff therefore believes the response by emergency services was timely and effective. This completes my presentation.
Mr. Chairman, that completes staff's presentations. We're prepared to respond to any questions.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much for those presentations, which were very well done. We'll now turn to questions from the board. Vice Chairman Landsberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and staff, for a very thorough briefing on this. Obviously, weather played a key part in this tragedy, and it appears that severe thunderstorm watch was issued timely and that they were tracking the storm for several hours. For meteorologist Richards, talk to us a little bit about gust fronts and how far they might precede an area of precipitation, if you would, sir.
Sure. So outflow boundaries can precede advancing convection for miles. There's not necessarily a rule. It's highly dependent upon the environmental conditions. It's not uncommon to have convection that doesn't have an outflow boundary leading the convection by miles. In this case, as this derecho was approaching the accident area, the outflow boundary led the main area of convection by about 10 to 12 miles, which is not uncommon.
Do you believe that the severe thunderstorm warning was given on an adequate time? Did this give Ride the Ducks and the captain sort of adequate notice to be able to make a good go, no-go decision?
I can speak as far as the issuance of it, the forecasting of it. I believe that it was definitely adequate from the forecaster's perspective.
I was noticing in the transcript that the captain made some reference to weather. He talked about radar and rain and so on. In your estimation, do you think that the captain was aware, not aware of the encroaching weather?
Mr. Vice Chairman, we will discuss that between myself and the Nautical Operations Group Chairman. But just to be clear, we were not able to interview the captain. We were able to receive the transcript of an interview conducted by Missouri State Highway Patrol. And we don't have the exact details as to which radar and how far out the storm was when the captain did view it prior to his 1830 departure, nor do we know at what point he did view that.
why were you not able to interview the captain or some of the operations personnel?
During the course of the on-scene investigation, there were several agencies that were conducting parallel investigations. One of the parallel investigations is a criminal investigation, and due to that, several key witnesses declined to be interviewed by NTSB.
You know, one of our objective obviously is safety, to figure out the what, the why, and prevent these things from happening again. And I think when we have parallel criminal investigations going on, it really does chill our ability to be able to get to those factors, and that's a concern. One last question in this round: what's the wind limit on ducks, stretch ducks, and relative to the wind that actually developed?
Our nautical group chairman, Marcel Muse, is prepared to answer that question regarding the restrictions on the certificate of inspection.
Thank you, Vice Chairman. The certificate inspection for this duck boat was limited them to 35 miles per hour. That varies around the country, but in the local Coast Guard there restricted them to 35.
So essentially the winds that arrived were almost double the maximum allowable for this vessel. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Very good. Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back the rest of my time to the next round. Thank you.
Vice Chairman Landsberg, thank you very much for your questions, and we'll now proceed to Member Hamady.
Thank you very much. I have a cell phone, which when there is a thunderstorm watch or a thunderstorm warning, I get a little bit of a notification, an alert on the cell phone, which informs me of a coming thunderstorm, whether it's a watch or a warning, and it continues to inform me as that approaches. And I think we take for granted what the difference is between a severe thunderstorm watch and a severe thunderstorm warning. And I appreciate staff's presentation, which included really the technical definition by the National Weather Service. But when I was looking at NOAA's website, it talked about, for the public, that a watch is when conditions are favorable for severe thunderstorms, and that persons in these areas should be on the lookout for threatening weather conditions and listen for later statements and possible warnings. That's a watch. The warning, that watch came at 11:20 a.m., correct?
Correct.
The warning, which came much later, about 7 hours later at 6:32 p.m., a warning is when severe thunderstorms are occurring or imminent, which I believe you talked about in your presentation. And according to the National Weather Service, people in that affected area should seek safe shelter immediately. So you have a severe thunderstorm watch that was issued at 11:20 until 9 p.m. And then over the course of the next 7 hours, the National Weather Service continued to issue updates for the incoming weather. And then Ride the Ducks had a computer weather monitoring program through Earth Networks, which is called Streamer RT, which I'm sure we'll get into at some point. But in addition to that computer weather program, they were getting regular emails from Earth Networks throughout the day about this weather coming in, including the severe thunderstorm warning, which they got that email at 6:32 p.m., correct? The same time the National Weather Service issued theirs.
We understand and we know the emails were sent, but because we were not able to interview certain key players, we don't know if they were received or opened. So, but yes, you're correct, they were sent.
Okay. So, and I'm going to I'll come back later in other rounds to ask about that. But so the warning was issued during the time of the watch, 34 Ride the Duck boats tours were completed. I don't include the 35th because that was replaced by another vessel at some point. So then 4 boats, if you could bring up slide 35 really quick, 4 vessels leave after the 6:32 p.m. warning was issued. So Duck 27 enters the lake at 6:45, 13 minutes after the warning. 17, 6:47, 15 minutes later after the warning. 54 at 6:53, they enter the lake at 21 minutes after the warning. And Stretch Duck 7, which sank, enters the lake at 6:55, 23 minutes later. Are there radios on the vessel that allow the duck dock to call the captain, and was 13 to 23 minutes enough time for management to have called the vessels and told them not to go on the water?
Thank you, Member Homerty. Our Nautical Operations Group Chairman, Marcel Muse, will respond to that question.
Thank you, Member Homerty. And yes, all the boats were equipped with a VHF radio. The company also had a repeater system where they could talk to each duck boat. So that capability to communicate with the boats was available to them.
And that time frame of 13 to 23 minutes, I mean, we're talking the duck dock, they left the duck dock, which is not on the side of the lake, which is 6 miles away from the lake. That's enough time to where the duck dock could have called.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, and then really quickly, how long were the water tours typically? And was that taken account, that time frame on the water when they assessed the risks of operating during the storm warning?
The typical water tour would take 15 minutes. Because the manager on duty sent Duck 7 to the lake first, our understanding was that they believed they had time to enter the water and get off before the storm arrived.
Okay, thank you very much. My time's up, and I'll hold the rest for additional rounds.
Thank you very much, Member Homendy. And Member Graham, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to switch away from the weather at this time and switch to the NAVIC to start a discussion about the side curtains. So what did the NAVIC say about having the side curtain closed on the water?
Thank you, Member Graham. Our Survival Factors Group Chairman, Michael Carr, will be prepared to answer that question.
Member Graham, the NAVIC talked about when to lower the side curtain and when to raise it. So when severe weather was approaching, the curtain should have been raised. And the concern there was to have less of a sail area.
Okay, sorry, I lost you for part of that with my connection. Can you restate that? I lost you on the internet here.
The operations manual instructed the captains to raise the side curtains during severe weather.
Okay, thank you. And what did the operations manual say, the Ride the Ducks operation manual say about having the side curtains down?
Well, the side curtains were to be raised during severe weather, and when they could be down, there really was no guidance other than, during the investigation, we learned, yes, if there was rain, put the side curtains down to protect the passengers. However, during severe weather, they were to be raised.
I think we may have lost Member Graham there for a second. Looks like a still photograph, still picture there. So, Member Graham, are you able to hear us? tell you what we'll do. We will move to Member Chapman, and when we get up and running again with your connection, Member Graham, we will come back to you. Member Chapman, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And my thanks to the, I see that Member Graham is back. Mr. Chairman, would you like for Mr. Graham to continue?
Well, if you don't mind, I think that'd be nice. Member Graham, go ahead and finish up. And I'm sorry you're having some internet connectivity issues, but I guess that's par for the course for virtual board meetings. Okay, tell you what, looks like he was trying to get on with his phone, but Member Chapman, go ahead. You're recognized for 5 minutes. Thank you.
I'll proceed. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm concerned by the continued and relatively widespread reliance on these very old vehicles. Most were designed, well, the fleet was designed in the 1940s, and my understanding is most were built in that time frame as well. And of course, they were intended for transportation of military personnel and not civilian passengers. Are more modern amphibious vehicles manufactured which lack the significant design flaws which are inherent in the duck vehicles?
Good morning, Member Chapman. Yes, there are other types of amphibious vessels. One that comes to mind is what they call a Hydra-Terra vessel, where they are different models that do have more reserve buoyancy and other options that have been incorporated some of their ideas in our recommendations.
Thank you. And are there operators in the U.S. or other countries which have fleets which are largely comprised of these more modern amphibious vehicles?
There are both, yes, here in the States and overseas. There are other operators that do use these other types, but there are not tremendous fleets of them. They're very small in numbers.
And to what extent is it possible to retrofit the original duck amphibious vehicles and essentially correct the inherent design flaws?
We've made recommendations in 2000, 2001, and 2002 to add reserve buoyancy to these. It is a challenge due to the construction of these vessels. Companies have looked into additional flotation, compartmentalization, other types of subdivision. There are some operators in Europe that have sponsons that are attached in the water. It is not an easy feat, but there have been studies done as a result of the Miss Majestic sinking.
Thank you. I want to ask a few questions about the regulation of these vehicles. Obviously, when it comes to regulating safety, the nature of an amphibious vehicle presents special challenges. We have vehicles that travel on both land and sea, and that triggers multiple regulatory jurisdictions. And some of those jurisdictions overlap and potentially conflict. What are the various regulatory responsibilities when it comes to NHTSA, for example, the Coast Guard, and perhaps the states as well?
Our nautical group chairman, Marcel Muse, will respond to that question.
Thank you, Member Chapman. The design of the boat and the certification of the boat falls to the Coast Guard. The vessel was inspected by the Coast Guard annually and run through drills both on land and in the water. NHTSA would regulate the construction of the vehicle to meet the motor safety regulations for a vehicle on land. They don't actually do inspections. That's left to the state. In Missouri, specifically, though, treated it as a boat. It was registered as a boat instead of as a vehicle. Because it's also considered a bus by the Motor Carrier Agency, it's also regulated by them for the operation side of it.
Do the states vary in how they treat these? Some treat them as boats, some treat them as highway vehicles, or both? Or do you know?
We didn't look into other states for this accident.
Thank you. And is there some overall approach to coordinating these various jurisdictional responsibilities, or is it sort of a haphazard approach?
We're not aware of any coordination, if there is any, between these agencies, no.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll hold some additional questions for a later round.
Member Chapman, thank you very much. I understand that Member Graham was back up in some form or fashion. So Member Graham, you're recognized.
Okay, are you guys hearing me okay now?
Yes.
Okay, you're just not going to have my my video to let you know. So not sure what happened with the internet here. So I'd like to go back to the side curtains. I'm sure you've already spoke about all this. Can you just tell me about what the side curtain can do in the high wind situation?
Well, this is Mike Carr. The operations manual cautioned about raising the side curtain. They didn't specifically say why, but they described it particularly when there were high winds. And I would assume that that's to cut down on the sail area when the vessel is beamed to.
Okay, yeah, so it basically creates a big sail for the boat that's already struggling in the water at that time. I'd like to switch to the reserve buoyancy and talk a little bit about, we know stretch duct 54 entered the water before stretch duct 7, I think you said by about 2 minutes. Which boat was farther from the exit ramp when the storm hit?
The stretch duct 54, we estimated, was about 500 feet further away from the exit ramp about the time of the severe weather affecting both vessels.
Okay, so in the process of making the escape to the exit ramp, we saw in the video that actually stretch duct 54 was farther away, but actually past stretch duct 7. Is that correct?
That's correct. We did a video analysis, and we understood with the GPS data that the stretch duct 54 was able to maintain about 4 knots or 4 miles an hour to reach the exit ramp. And with our calculations, we understood the stretch duct 7 to do about 1.7 miles per hour.
Okay. Now you did talk a little bit, can you remind me about the differences between stretch duct 54 and stretch duct 7?
Yes, the stretch duct 54 was a newer version. When it was built with a 6-inch wider beam and about a 6-inch higher gunnel, which gave it more freeboard. And additionally, it had a different forward hatch configuration in which the forward hatch was covered by a solid steel plate and bolted down with fasteners, as opposed to the stretch duct 7, which had a smaller beam, a lower freeboard, and a forward hatch that was held upward with a spring. And the design of that was, the intent of that was to be able to close in the event of a fire and somehow suffocate the engine compartment. There was no way for that forward hatch to resist more than about 3 pounds of weight before it opened against the spring tension.
Thank you. Did the company just have these 2 configurations of they had the stretch duct and the master rig? Is that correct? Is that the only 2 types they had?
The company also had 2 truck ducts, which are the same ballpark dimension as the master jig, and they also had stretch duct versions.
Do you know how many of each of the stretch and the master rig, master jig?
I don't have the chart in front of me, but possibly the Nautical Operations Group Chairman may have a better estimation.
Okay, so basically they had a variety of each type of configuration of stretch ducts. So after watching the various videos of the sinking and with what the staff found during the investigation, if stretch duct 54 had been just the standard stretch duct, in the staff's opinion, do you think it would have sunk also in these conditions?
One of the pieces of evidence that we were not able to understand was the captain of the stretch duct 7 decision or actions regarding the speed of the vessel. We were able to interview the captain of the stretch duck 54, and he indicated that he put the throttle to maximum to give increased speed to exit the ramp, to the ramp. We don't know the factors of the speed of the stretch duck 7, but the stretch duck 54 was certainly better equipped to handle the weather as opposed to the stretch duck 7.
Okay, so we very well may have, if we would have had two of the similar stretch duck 54 with similar stretch duck 7, we could have actually had two sinkings on that day during that storm, and most likely many more fatalities. Mr. Chairman, I see my time's up. I yield back to you.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate your resiliency by being able to get back up and running with your iPhone there, and that's due to the credit of you and also Mike Anthony, our CIO, who suggested that we come up with that contingency plan. So thank you very much. Mr. Young, as the investigator in charge, I want to ask this question to you. We generally sort of try and finish our reports when we can in about a 12-month period of time. We're a little bit past that point at this point, and I understand there's some factors for that. So if you could discuss those, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There were certainly some challenges in this investigation, and our office director, Morgan Terrell, will speak to that.
Thank you.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Brian. The criminal investigation by the Department of Justice prevented the NTSB and the Coast Guard safety investigators from interviewing key witnesses such as the captain. The criminal investigation also delayed the technical review of our factual reports and the Coast Guard's Marine Board. We wanted to conduct in-depth interviews with the captain and other company employees, which would have covered the safety issues identified in the draft report, such as the company officials' awareness of the severe thunderstorm warning.
Well, thank you. And, it's a very good investigation. I think I appreciate the good work that you all have done. And I understand their criminal investigation it needs to move, and ours needs to move. And so fact is, we've got to work together, and appreciate your ability to get things done as much as you have been able to. Mr. Young, I suspect these next few questions are for Mr. Richards, but I'll let you decide that. But I'm interested to know, what were the cloud tops of this thunderstorm system as it moved through this area?
They were above 45,000 feet. I would have to put my best estimate at about 46,000 feet.
Yeah, so anything that high is going to potentially have a lot of wind and hail associated with it. I think in the questions to member Hamady, you stated that with a severe thunderstorm warning, that means that you're potentially going to get hail greater than 1 inch and winds greater than 58 miles per hour, I believe. So I was in California that day, and as I had either lunch or breakfast in the hotel restaurant, they had maybe one of the network TV shows on, and they were showing the severe weather as it was moving through the Kansas City area. As it moved through Kansas City and moved southeast toward Branson, did it do any widespread damage as it was moving along?
Yes, it certainly did damage. Most of the damage reports that I saw were due to the straight line winds at the surface. I can recall as it progressed south of the Kansas City area, reports of 9 and 10 inch diameter tree limbs being snapped. But that certainly wasn't necessarily the worst wind related damage, just what I recall from near the Kansas City area.
Thank you. And I sort of missed the very last part of what you said. I think you said that certainly was not what?
That wasn't necessarily the worst wind-related damage associated with this derecho, but it's what I recall from near the Kansas City area, which is what you asked about.
Yeah, and as it progressed southeastward toward Branson, was there other wind damage, straight line wind damage from the storm?
Certainly, this derecho produced straight line wind damage from Kansas through Missouri and into northern Arkansas.
So the derecho part of this did not just begin close to Branson.
No, how we define derecho is we really have to go back after the fact and look at how long the damage, distance-wise, how long it occurred. So in the moment, we don't call it a derecho. After the fact, we go back and look at it. But yes, this storm produced damage for hundreds of miles.
Right. I'm really out of time, but just to go into the break, which we will take in just a moment, tell us what a derecho is. You know, up until a few years ago, the NTSB had never even heard of the thing. So what is it?
It's sure, Mr. Chairman. It's a severe thunderstorm complex. It's characterized. It requires, by definition, to have severe wind gusts at the surface, which is 58 miles per hour. They're generally large geographically, and they last a long time. They can cross multiple states during its life cycle. I believe the requirement for its damage path must last at least 400 kilometers. So by definition, it is long-lasting and widespread.
Thank you. In just a moment, I will call for a break. Before we do so, I'll invite everyone participating in the meeting to turn off your cameras and your microphones. And at this point, we will take a break. We will reconvene in 15 minutes, which is basically going to be 11 o'clock. So we are in recess. Good morning. We'll begin in about 1 minute. Okay, we are back in session. We will begin with the second round of questions, and Vice Chairman Landsberg, you are recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I think you had mentioned earlier about the height of thunderstorms being a pretty good indication of how bad things are going to be. I guess this would go to Mr. Richards. About how fast was this line of weather moving as it approached Branson?
Sure, it varied over its lifespan, but as it approached Branson, it was about 60 miles per hour.
60 miles per hour.
60.
So we have basically some very tall storms moving very quickly. So anybody with a rudimentary understanding of weather could get a pretty good idea that this is the real deal. Is that a fair statement?
I believe so.
Okay, all right. Well, that leads me to my next question, and this is probably for Mr. Young to direct. What does the Coast Guard require for training for captains of small commercial vessels that are operating in limited waters, protected waters, as far as weather?
Thank you, Vice Chairman. Our Nautical Operations Group Chairman, Marcel Muse, is prepared to speak to the training and licensing requirements for the limited tonnage masters.
Thank you, Vice Chairman, for the question. Limited tonnage masters can get a license one of two ways. Traditionally, is you would study the material that the Coast Guard lists on their site and take an exam at a regional exam center, a Coast Guard regional exam center. There's some minimum experience depending on the level of license required. That exam would include meteorology questions. The other way is to take an approved course, a course that's approved by the Coast Guard, such as what Ride the Ducks had. That course also includes meteorology.
In your opinion, is that training adequate as it currently exists?
So the Coast Guard list, there's 30 pages of references that they draw their exam questions from. 16 of those line items are weather related. We've we made a recommendation to the Coast Guard to revisit the material and make sure it's appropriate for these small vessel operators.
Is there some thought process that goes into the idea that because you're operating in protected waters, that maybe it isn't as necessary to have that much depth, particularly of severe type weather?
Well, certainly the issues are different for these small vessel operators. They're no less significant, though. They're just different issues versus hurricane avoidance, for example, versus what we saw in this case. And again, that's why we'd like the Coast Guard to revisit that material and make sure that there is appropriate material for these limited tonnage and small vessel operator credentials.
What other accidents have we investigated, the NTSB, that have involved weather of small commercial vessels?
I'm aware of a small vessel in Baltimore. I'd like to pass that off to one of my colleagues that was more familiar with that case.
Mr. Vice Chairman, that was the Lady D. It was a small pontoon passenger ferry that was exposed to severe weather and capsized and sank.
So this isn't the first time that we've had vessels of limited seaworthiness getting into difficulty because apparently the captain, who is the final authority to the operation of the vessel, didn't have a clear understanding of what A, the vessel was capable of, or B, the possibility that it could be in jeopardy because of this kind of weather. Is that a fair statement?
The first part of the statement is correct, in which weather definitely affected these vessels. For the Stretch Duck 7, this accident, we were not able to interview the captain, but we do have several references that he did look at the weather, but we don't have the exact details as to how close the weather was or how far away the storm was approaching, or we don't know for a fact of the details in which he looked at the radar.
Understand. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Vice Chairman. And Member Hamady, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I do have a number of substantive questions related to the investigation, the specifics, but I want to switch gears a little bit because the chairman mentioned in his opening statement that there are 4,000 pages in the docket of investigative material. It's quite extensive. Each of the board members have gone through it. We've looked at inward-facing videos, outward-facing videos. We've looked at videos and pictures on the internet that were shared by witnesses. But I want to make sure the public knows that while we had challenges in this investigation, that we were able to conduct a thorough investigation. So and I know you mentioned that we had trouble interviewing key personnel. We weren't able to do that. What information did staff rely on for conducting the investigation that helped us determine what happened, why it happened, so that we can prevent it from happening again?
Thank you, Member Hamady. The biggest piece of evidence that we were able to review and used that helped us support this investigation was the vessel's DVR, or digital video recorder. Not only did that record the voice and actions of the captain and driver, it also showed the conditions the vessel was exposed to upon entering the lake, as well as when it encountered severe weather. Another very, very helpful bit of information came from witnesses who provided cell phone video, pictures, and witness statements, not only from the showboat Branson Belle, but from ashore, as well as first responders. That definitely helped us put the pieces of the puzzle together so that we can understand the challenges that occurred that day to the vessel and the passengers and crew.
It's not new that there would be, I mean, sometimes there's interference, but it's not new to us that sometimes there are concurrent investigations where federal or state authorities are pursuing a criminal investigation while we're doing our safety investigation. Sometimes it does interfere with our abilities to go forward, but there are some processes in place where we can communicate with them and move forward, correct?
Absolutely. And between the different agencies throughout the investigation, we worked well together, and we relied on each other to obtain certain information and certain evidence, such as the Missouri State Highway Patrol has a fleet of divers that assisted us in obtaining the DVR from the sunken vessels. The Coast Guard has various local entities that assist us on scene. The National Weather Service assists us, Ride the Ducks as a party. All these different entities as parties to the investigation were tremendous assistance to us to complete the investigation.
Thank you. And I do want to stress the importance of those. A lot of times when we're on scene, you'll hear me say, if witnesses have video or photos, send them into witness@ntsb.gov, because that helps us there. And I saw that in those videos that you showed as part of your presentation, Mr. Young, you noted the source, and it was somebody that was on Showboat Branson Bell, who, and I have to, my understanding is she had been criticized for taking some of that video, but actually it helped us with our investigation.
Absolutely. It was a tremendous assistance to us so we could understand the weather the vessel was exposed to and see how the vessel subsequently lowered into the water, and also some of the waves that affected the bow of the vessel. And it was a big help, and we were very appreciative for that assistance.
Absolutely. And I only have about 30 seconds left, but I want you to take a moment to talk about our relationship with the Coast Guard, because that relationship is important. I've been to many of they've welcomed me to many of their facilities around the U.S. over the last almost 2 years, and I worked closely with them on the conception, Captain Neubauer in particular. And so I want to talk, if you could talk briefly about our relationship with the Coast Guard, and then how this investigation moved forward and why we are the lead on the investigation. And after you answer that, Mr. Chairman, I will hold the rest of my questions and you can go ahead.
I'll start off by saying that the Coast Guard and NTSB on this investigation, we were very fortunate to work very well with the team, that the MBI team had been established and convened. We collected factual evidence together. And at the point, once we are done collecting as much information as we can, we split off and we conduct our own analysis. For the bigger picture between Coast Guard and NTSB, our Office Director, Morgan Terrell, is prepared to respond to that question.
Thank you, Member Hamady, for that question. As Brian mentioned, the relationship in this investigation and the nearly 50 investigations Office of Marine Safety conducts every year, our relationship with the Coast Guard is the best it's ever been. We thank them for their cooperation on this investigation and every one that we do, from their sector investigators all the way up to headquarters. And as you mentioned, Captain Neubauer and his boss, Admiral Timmy. To get to your question as to why we led this investigation, when the incident was reported, the NTSB and the Coast Guard determined the NTSB should lead the safety investigation. This determination was made based on the 2008 MOU, which is currently under revision. Both agencies worked together to determine the facts and then each independently write their own analysis and final report. The MOU identifies 6 criteria which indicate when the NTSB should be the lead. In this case, it was a loss of 3 or more lives on a commercial passenger vessel, and the loss of life or serious injury to 12 or more persons on any commercial vessel, in this case 17. Thank you.
Thank you.
Member Hamady, thank you very much for that, and I do appreciate your getting Morgan to expand upon our relationship with the Coast Guard. Thank you very much. Let's see, Member Graham, I believe you're back up and running, but still audio only, and I understand there's been some sort of a outage in some respects nationwide, but if you can tell us a little bit about that, if you know anything about it, but nevertheless, you are recognized. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm not sure I understand that they're working on it. Hopefully I'll have my video back up here in a little bit. I'd like to go back to weather for mariners and all, and talk a little bit about this. So can you tell me what, like, the most popular ways mariners may receive their weather information? So if I'm a captain and I have paying passengers, what should I be looking at? And what specific sources are available for weather in the marine world?
Thank you, Member Graham. We'll turn this to our Nautical Operations Group Chairman, Marcel Muse.
Thank you for the question. The where to obtain weather would vary depending on the operation. It's very different for the size of vessels, especially. In this case, for a small passenger vessel, Your media sources or your information would come from the media. It could come from the Weather Service itself. They continuously broadcast the weather forecast. They also publish it online. The Coast Guard in certain areas will rebroadcast weather warnings as well. So there are multiple places to get weather from.
Okay.
And in this case,
Yeah,
Member
go ahead.
Brown, the company subscribed to a weather service and had a big screen TV in the captain's lounge that was available to the company in their headquarters at the duck dock.
Okay. So is there any requirement for a captain of the such to, before he sets sail, to look at the weather before he goes? Is there a requirement?
The regulations specifically require the captain to be familiar with what the forecast is. Yes, sir.
Is to be familiar with the forecast? Okay. I think there was there were some statements in the docket that the maybe the general manager had made with his interview. I believe it might have been with the state police the night of, that there was no requirement for him to basically check the weather. Is that a correct statement?
So the regulations in subchapter T specifically are for the master of the vessel. As a manager, that would be correct. There's nothing specifically in subchapter T that would require shoreside staff to monitor the weather.
Correct. And there's nothing in the operations manual I went through that said anything. It did talk about the weather on the water, but it wasn't that staff had to be monitoring it from the duck dock. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, great. I'd like to switch over to the training question. I was reviewing an early license, I think what's called an OUPB, an operator of uninspected passenger vessels. Is that a place where a mariner might start with an initial license?
That would be an initial license. That's what's known in industry as a six-pack. It allows you to carry 6 passengers for hire. Quite a bit lower than what this captain had.
Okay, so that's a place, and it's my understanding that the many of the captains at the Ride the Ducks actually did their own in-course or in-house training course, but my understanding that the captain of Stretch Duck 7 actually had a master's mate license of 100 tons. Is that under 100 tons? Is that correct?
That's correct. This captain had a 100-ton license. Those new captains that take Ride the Ducks in-house course have a 25-ton license, which is good enough for this size vessel. The requirements for the 2 licenses are virtually the same. The only difference is the experience on the higher tonnage vessels.
Okay, thank you. So he didn't have the in-house training. He did it kind of the old-fashioned way, the way I guess many mariners do. I was looking at this OUPB syllabus, and nowhere in the recommendations, or in the I should say the table of contents, is it talks anywhere about weather. And then I looked at the another course, the upgrade from that, and the master's mate course from a local school here in the DC area. And to get the upgrade to that master's mate, their table of contents only covers 5 things: seamanship, federal regs, navigation, watchkeeping, and safety. I went through the whole book, and there's nothing on weather for an upgrade to a master's mate. So that just bothered me that there's no discussion about weather. I see my time's up, so I yield back to the chairman.
Member Graham, thank you very much. And now Member Chapman, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a couple of questions. The draft report describes the efforts of the crew and the passengers of the showboat Branson Belle, and also talks about the efforts of other Good Samaritans who rushed to the site of the accident. I want, first of all, to personally commend these individuals for their contributions to the rescue effort. Will you and your team, Mr. Young, please elaborate on the importance of the efforts of Good Samaritans to the rescue of survivors?
Yes, thank you. Not only did Captain Muse take care of the Nautical Operations Group Chairman, but he doubled up as the Emergency Response Group Chairman. And he did a number of interviews with the first responders and several passengers and crew of the Showboat Branson Belle that actually entered the water and provided life-saving appliances to some of the occupants of Stretch Duck 7. And he may be able to elaborate on that.
To elaborate a little bit on the response, Member Chapman, the survivors and the first responders that we talked to were consistently told us that the crew of the Showboat Branson Belle were instrumental in all the survivors. There was also pontoon boats on the water that came to the assistance of the survivors that were in the water. Not just the crew of the Showboat Branson Belle, but also the passengers helped out as well. They also employed a sheriff's deputy and an EMT on board. So by the time the first responders arrived, what rescue could be done was done. Triage had already started, and first aid had already started as well.
Thank you. I mean, it's obviously a great tragedy, but the response of those that helped in the rescue is very heartening. Obviously, in this one example, life jackets would have impeded egress, and you've highlighted those concerns and the reason for those concerns. Would you also discuss, please, the overall safety value of life jackets in terms of water travel?
Our survival group chairman, Michael Carr, will discuss the advantages of life jackets for waterborne travel, as well as the issues when there is impediments to escape.
Well, Member Chapman simply stated, the NTSB fully supports life jackets. They are necessary for survival. They are necessary when folks are on the water, particularly on a commercial vessel. They're type 1 life jackets, and type 1 life jackets are designed to keep people's heads above water.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I have no further questions, and I'm happy to yield back.
Thank you very much, Member Chapman. Again, Mr. Young, I suspect this next question or two will be directed to Mr. Richards, but I'll let you decide that. In conversations with Ripley, and I think I met with the Ripley representatives yesterday, and I think they may have met with a few of my colleagues on the board. I certainly read their submission, and in conversations with Ripley Entertainment, who of course operates Ride the Ducks Branson, they stated that the weather was being depicted further away than it actually was. And so, Mr. Richards, what do we know about the possible latency of NexRad images?
So there is latency inherent in most weather radar products that the public looks at. It's just part of the business in trying to put together a picture from various from data that comes in at various times. It's to a point it's unavoidable. However, the service that they were using in-house to look at what we believe to look at weather radar information had some additional latency such that they received the weather radar product from a second vendor and then did some processing on it, which took a few minutes, and ended up displaying that weather radar information a handful of minutes after they had received it, which is in addition to any inherent latency that's in the process. I'm not sure if that answered your question.
Well, I mean, it's the NTSB issued a safety alert for aviation in 2012, where we said that this information could be 15 to 20 minutes behind what it really is. And in an FAA, I realize we're not talking about aviation here, but still in an FAA advisory circular AC 0024 Charlie issued in 2013, it talked about the latency of these images from NextRad being 15 to 20 minutes old. So if we know that in aviation, what I'm wondering is what training did Ride the Ducks have with respect to the latency of NextRad images from their commercial vendor?
I am not aware of any training specifically on the usage of weather radar. I may need to defer to our investigator in charge.
From limited interviews, Mr. Chairman, we weren't able to talk to the manager on duty that was observing the weather that day, but we do understand there were some online courses for the vendor product that they were using. We don't know how in-depth it was.
And I know from reading the report, the draft report, that they had received some sort of training. Maybe that was just how to use the software product. They received something like that. Maybe it was more how to use the product. Is that correct?
Yeah, yes, sir. We're aware that they were in touch in the past with the vendor for a training or familiarity with the system, but we do not know exactly what the content of that was.
Well, thanks. You know, the notion of a gust front preceding a severe thunderstorm is not a new phenomena. I've got an aviation background, but still aviators like mariners need to have extensive knowledge of weather. And I was looking in again an aviation publication, the same one I mentioned earlier, AC 0024 Charlie, and it talked about the gust front can extend out from about 15 miles ahead of the precipitation. And earlier today, I think in response to something to the vice chairman, you said that the gust front in this particular system extended out maybe 10 to 12 miles. So the notion, just, the severe weather doesn't start right where the precip begins. It extends out forward of that. Do you agree with that?
I do, Mr. Chairman. I do agree with that. Yes.
And in fact, in this particular tragic event, we saw the winds, which reached up to, I think, 73 miles an hour. That really sort of preceded the precipitation?
Yes, it did. It preceded it, like you said, about 10 to 12 miles ahead of the heavier convection. In fact, the severe thunderstorm warning, when it defined the latitude, longitude of the hazardous event, the forecaster at the Weather Service defined the outflow boundary, leading the convection, because they believed it was the initial impact that someone would feel from this storm.
Thank you. I'm out of time. We'll go to the next round. Vice Chairman Landsberg, you're up next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess just a quick note. Do we know how long Ripley Ride the Ducks has been in business there on Table Rock Lake?
The duck operation had been in business on the lake with different owners since the early 1970s, but Ripley actually purchased the business in 2017, and they started running as Ride the Ducks, doing business as Ride the Ducks Branson.
So is it conceivable that they would have a pretty good idea of the kind of weather conditions that could develop in the summertime there?
It would be understandable to say that, yes.
I think you can see where that's going, and the fact that this shouldn't have been their first rodeo, and that, we can, and I certainly respect and understand the chairman's point about latency on radar, and we've talked about the gust fronts and all of those things. But the reality is that, when severe thunderstorms are around and they're headed your way at a high rate of speed and so forth, you better be prepared to deal with it. So I think, as we get into our findings and our recommendations, that will be reflected. I'd like to go to survival for a moment. Could you tell us what Ride the Ducks guidance was on donning of life jackets in the cases of impending dangerous weather?
Vice Chairman, it's Mike Carr. The operations manual talked about the captain ordering the passengers to get into their life jackets when there were three things that they were facing. And that is when the fire was out of control, when the bilge alarm sounded but also indicated a high level of water, and then the third thing was when the vessel was losing freeboard, such that the captain could anticipate that the vessel might swamp.
Okay, so the captain's guidance was, if any, certainly the latter two things would apply in this case. So did the captain direct them to don their life jackets?
From the evidence we've seen, the captain did not direct them to don their life jackets.
Okay, and I think we've talked at some length about the fact that in vessels, these kinds of vessels with canopies and side curtains, if you do don the life jacket, then you're going to have a problem escaping. Is that a fair statement?
That is a statement that staff has expressed in the draft report.
Okay, so on the one hand, you're told to put on your life jacket, which will help you survive after exiting the vessel. And on the other hand, you're told, we know from experience and prior recommendations that if you put it on, you have a significant chance of being trapped inside the vessel. This seems like a no-win situation to me. What are the, in your estimation, what would be the survival circumstances if you did not have a life jacket and you were in these kind of weather conditions for the typical passenger, including elderly and children, with 70-knot winds and 3 to 5 foot waves?
Having a life jacket would have been beneficial, particularly in this accident. 17 people lost their lives. Some of those people were found on the surface of the water. And staff believes that if they were wearing life jackets, they would have survived. So life jackets would definitely improve survivability. But as staff points out, if a vessel's got a canopy and you've got your life jacket on, you're going to have trouble exiting the vessel.
So we have a catch-22 essentially here. You know, in aviation, and the chairman's already mentioned that, you know, the FAA requires evacuation of a full aircraft, a commercial aircraft, in under 90 seconds. And I think I read somewhere that the boat sank once things really got going in about 10 to 15 seconds. How long would it take to exit a fully loaded duck, even if you were not wearing a life jacket?
Vice Chairman, I can't tell you exactly, but if you're sitting on the duck and the captain has briefed you that your escape is over the side, so without a life jacket, if the captain told you to escape, ideally you would know right away without any hesitation. You would, you know, grab your children first and put them over the side and then exit yourself. So it could be done rather quickly.
Okay.
And in this case, the vessel was the escape route, was over the side, and that was based on the lessons learned from the Miss Majestic, where they were supposed to go to the aisle and exit aft. So in a NAVIC, they improved the escape by saying, okay, everyone over the side.
And that didn't work.
Well, what staff would have loved for everyone, staff would have liked it such that everyone would have gotten off the vessel before it sank and put everybody into that situation.
All right. Yeah, I think what we're seeing here is a very difficult circumstance of conflicting guidance, and I think there are certainly some opportunities. Mr. Chairman, I yield back and have no further questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And yeah, I lost my connection there just for a quick moment, but okay, Member Hamady, you're
Thank
next.
you. Thank you very much. I want to follow up on something the chairman said, which he talked about Ripley's party submission, which talked about they essentially delayed. They talked about weather monitoring and basically said that their weather monitoring system had delays, and it really was all up to the captain at that point. And I'm summarizing, but even with their streamer RT having delays or some latency, you still had National Weather Service announcements all day long, starting at 11:20. You still had emails from their own weather monitoring service, which we've compiled, Earth Networks, which we've compiled in attachment 18 of the Meteorology Group factual report, which is in our docket. And there was some additional information that they could have utilized from Earth Networks that they didn't, which is this DTA dangerous thunderstorm alerts. Is that correct, Mr. Young?
Yes, that's correct. That was an option from the weather provider.
Yeah, and I want to read something from the factual report, which good job on those. It says on July 21, the operations manager for Ride the Ducks Branson stated to the NTSB group that the Earth Networks DTA, dangerous thunderstorm alerts, can be too informative and goes off a lot, so they didn't use it. And had they used it, we have at 6:37, they would have gotten a dangerous thunderstorm alert, which said, this storm contains frequent lightning and has an increased potential to produce severe weather and should be considered dangerous. Take appropriate measures to ensure safety to life and property immediately. But because they didn't avail themselves of that function, because it was too informative, they did not get that. But they did get other alerts. And so I want to go back to the stretch duck 7. So the 7 leaves the duck dock at 6:30, and the manager on duty gets on board right before they leave and says, do the lake portion of this, because they are trying to beat the storm. So they agree to go to the lake. 23 minutes later, they enter the lake. But 2 minutes after they left the duck dock, this thunderstorm warning came from the National Weather Service, which was from 6:30 to 7:30 p.m. At that point, the driver and the captain is on the tour, headed towards the lake. So I already know from a previous question to you that there's a radio on the vessel. What about cell phones? I asked about cell phone alerts. Can the captain or driver use their cell phone? What does the operations manual say about cell phones?
The operations manual say they're prohibited for use while driving.
It says while driving and not during a tour, and that's for safety. That's a good thing. You should not have your cell phone on while driving or during the tour. But my point is, while on the road, what weather monitoring capabilities did the captain have while they were on tour?
In addition to driving and having a visual assessment of the weather on the road, that was one option. He did not have any weather monitoring tools or weather apparatus on board the Stretch Duck 7. And when the captain approached the lake, we do see from the forward-facing video camera that the view of the water was limited at the top of the ramp due to a tree-lined entrance, which precluded his ability to see up and down the lake. So his visual assessment of the lake upon entry was limited until he actually got into the lake.
It looked, I mean, from the video, it looks relatively calm, and many witnesses described it as calm and glassy. So who at that point, while they're en route, was in the best position to look at the rapidly changing weather conditions? Was it the manager at the duck dock or the duck dock employees? Was it the captain? Was it everybody?
We believe, based on the evidence we have reviewed, is that the manager on duty and the people at the duck dock had the most pertinent information to make that decision, while the ducks were either on the road before they departed the facility or before they entered the lake. That information was available from the Weather Service to the company at their facility, and they had the means to communicate to the vessels whether they were on road or water.
Thank you very much. My time has expired. I do have additional questions. You can take that slide down, slide 35, and I'll yield back to the chairman.
Thank you, Member Hamady, and we'll certainly come back for another round as well. Member Graham.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think I have my video back now, hopefully. I'm going to go back to the need for improved weather training, and I'm very happy to see in the finding that the staff is going to make a proposal here later for the findings to improve the training. Improved training is needed for small passenger vessel operators on rivers to better understand and recognize weather in their operations. I appreciate seeing that. I'd like to move back to the reserve buoyancy for just a minute here. Back in 1999, we looked at a similar accident of the Miss Majestic, I believe in Arkansas, and it sank under very similar conditions with the lack of reserve buoyancy and issues with the canopy. Can you tell me what we recommended at the time?
Yes, sir. There are two different issues there. One was the ability for the vessel to sink, and that was concerning the reserve buoyancy and the lack of compartmentalization, as well as the lack of subdivision. It pretty much is an open boat, and it is subject to rapid swamping and sinking. Additionally, the employment of a fixed canopy restricted the passengers' ease and ability to escape. So the two different issues, and as a result of both of these issues, we made recommendations to improve reserve buoyancy as well as remove the canopies or have the Coast Guard approve a Coast Guard approved canopy.
And what was the Coast Guard's response to that back then?
In 2002, those recommendations were closed, unacceptable, because the Coast Guard felt that there was sufficient guidance in place with using the NAVIC.
So here we are some almost 20 years later with a very similar sinking of a duck boat and with similar tragic results here. And back in November of 2019, we basically made the exact same recommendations again to the Coast Guard. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. There were very similar recommendations, and in the canopy recommendation, we also included the request to remove side curtains because we felt they were also an impediment to passenger escape.
Very good. And I understand that we have a response from the Coast Guard here within about the last week. Could you update us on that?
Yes, sir. Last week, the Coast Guard did reply to us, and they have come out with a MSIB, or Marine Safety Information Bulletin, that they are going to request that operators voluntarily remove canopies, and they have also partially concurred with our reserve buoyancy recommendation. So there has been a positive response from the Coast Guard based on these 2019 recommendations.
That is a good. That's good to hear. I'm happy to hear that. Let me switch over to the operational control of the operation, and specifically the guidance in the ops manual for Ride the Ducks. What are the three things that would forego water entry per the ops manual, their ops manual?
We will turn this over to the Nautical Operations Group Chairman, Marcel Muse.
Thank you, Member Graham. In addition to the restrictions on the COI, or the Certificate of Inspection, the Operations Manual Also prohibited entry into the water for if there's any kind of mechanical issue, if there was lightning in the area, or if there was severe weather approaching.
Okay, I want to focus in on the weather portion of that. What does lightning in the area mean?
The operations manual did not further define what lightning in the area meant, and we were unable to determine that from any of the interviews. We do know on the screen at the duck dock they had a 20-mile circle around their location, but what that meant, there was no further guidance in the operations manual.
Yeah, I think that the fact that there is no range on the lightning or no lightning detector that gives them that information, like I've seen in other operations, there's usually a range on the lightning to give a better description of that limitation and also the approaching severe weather. How far away, whatever, that is pretty in general and difficult to interpret for everybody out there. I also noticed in the ops manual there, it obviously doesn't meet a safety management system requirement. There's no accountable executive, and looking into that manual, it basically puts all the onus on the captains and the employees, and there's no accountable executive and nobody actually managing the daily risk of the operation. I see my time is up, and Mr. Chairman, I have no further questions. Thank you.
Member Graham, thank you very much. And do you have any questions past this point, Member Graham?
Mr. Chairman, I do not.
Okay, thanks. You may after the round, but if you do, just send me a text and we'll certainly come to you. And Member Chapman, I believe you have additional follow-up questions at this point.
I just have one final question, Mr. Chairman, and it relates to our recommendations on this. Our recommendations address both the reserve buoyancy issue and the canopies, but I'm told, and I'll appreciate your thoughts on this. I'm told that there are significant practical obstacles to improving the reserve buoyancy on these vehicles, and so it's effectively an either-or proposition. Improve the reserve buoyancy or remove the canopies. I guess if you could do both, that would be wonderful. But in effect, removing the canopies is the answer to the inherent flaws in this design. Is that correct, or would you comment on that, please?
We understand there are challenges to increase the reserve buoyancy. It is a hard task to do because of the design of these vessels with such a low freeboard. But in the interim, while this is being studied, to have the canopies removed would definitely prevent, and not only the canopies, but their associated framing, as well as the side curtains, would allow an unimpeded escape of passengers.
Thank you, and I want to thank all of you for your responses this morning. They've been very helpful. That's all I have in terms of questions, Mr. Chairman.
Member Chapman, thank you. I think all the board members' questions, by the way, have been very insightful as well as the answers. So thank you for that. What I'm going to say here is really a question, so be prepared to answer it. It's really a sort of, do you agree with this? One of the things that I kept reading in the Ripley Entertainment party submission, and we do appreciate parties. We appreciate their offering a party submission. And when I met with their management yesterday on the phone, one of the themes that kept coming up was that no one had ever seen a storm like this on Table Rock Lake, and it's just unprecedented. I think that was a term that they had seen, that they had used in their party submission. I'll say that up until 6 or 8 weeks ago, none of us had seen a pandemic, but every one of us understood the dangerous nature of a pandemic. So back to the issue of thunderstorms, even though no one had seen such a derecho, such a change of weather so quickly, does that mean that the hazards associated with the severe thunderstorm weren't there? It's really a yes or no question. I mean, if you understand the question, I won't make it a question then. The fact that they had never seen it doesn't mean the hazards didn't exist. And that's my point, is that any thunderstorm, any severe thunderstorm has the potential for hail and damaging winds. And in fact, this thunderstorm warning and even the watch, well, the warning itself called for winds 60 miles an hour or greater. The maximum of allowable wind for this vessel, according to the COI, was the certificate of inspection was 35 knots. So that ought to tell you right there that if you're forecasting winds in excess of 35 miles per hour or 35 knots, then that ought to put you on heightened alert. Does anybody disagree with that? Let me ask you this on a related, while I'm on that, let me mention this. At 1850, a passenger remarked to the captain of the Stretch Duck 27, who was also happened to be the general manager of Ride the Ducks. He saw lightning. The passenger remarked that there was lightning. What did the general manager do in response to that? Did he notify other ducks on the water, or did he notify the duck dock of the report of lightning? Because lightning, as we've already been discussed, lightning is one of those three factors that automatically will require the ducks to come out of the water. So did the general manager notify anybody?
No, sir.
Thanks. I'm just curious, as I was looking at the diagram, which we plotted out about the trek around the lake, when they first started to turn northbound, after they realized that the winds were really getting excessive, they were right close to Duck Island. And given that this was an amphibious vessel, was beaching on Duck Island even thank you. Was that even a possibility?
Mr. Chairman, again, just to reiterate, we did not get to speak with the captain to ask about his decision-making at this time, but from what we understood from an interview with the state police is that at the position he was at when the weather came on, he felt he was closer to the exit ramp. To answer your question, yes, the vehicle could be beached on Duck Island. The vehicle's equipped for land and water use. But one thing we did look into was to head to that direction could have compromised the vessel's position with wind and waves on the starboard side of the beam of the vessel.
Great. Thank you very much. I'm out of time. Vice Chairman, I understand you have no additional questions. Member Hamady.
Thank you. In Ripley Entertainment's submission to the board, and there's a quote, it says, a thunderstorm warning, a regular occurrence in southwest Missouri in the summer months, could not have fully prepared those who managed and operated the duck boats for the sudden onset of the storm and its unusual intensity. I disagree with that statement, but I find it interesting the addition of that a thunderstorm warning is a regular occurrence in southwest Missouri. So if your job is people are getting on the water, you would think that the weather is something you should take pretty seriously and actively monitor. I'm sure you would agree with that, Mr. Young. In Ripley's submission, they have a discussion about their safety management system, which is not required of them, but where I was disappointed is they say their safety management program is their manual. Could you briefly discuss what is a safety management system? It's not a manual.
Correct. And we'll turn this over to the Nautical Operations Group Chairman, Marcel Muse.
Thank you, Member Hamady. When we talk about safety management in the maritime world, we're usually referring to the International Safety Management Code, which again was not required for this vessel. That code has 13 elements, everything from executive accountability to the master's responsibilities, the company's responsibilities, auditing, and most importantly, what could have helped in this case, identifying critical tasks and having procedures to address those tasks. And in this case, weather monitoring was missing.
Right. So you're constantly addressing your risks and reevaluating them throughout the process. And just briefly, I think just because something isn't required doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. And I'm going to get into some of the regulatory aspects of that shortly. But just one thing I looked at is NOAA puts out an annual state-by-state tabulation of severe weather reports. And I was able to determine, and this is not my job, to constantly monitor weather like it is for Ride the Ducks, but I was able to determine relatively quickly that looking at the annual reports from 2018, 2017, 16, 15, 14, 13, that Missouri, out of all the states in the District of Columbia, ranks consistently third in the nation to seventh in the nation for the most weather reports. So if you know weather is a risk and it has a potential to be severe, you take that into account and in evaluating the risks. I would say the same for how you deal with canopies and side curtains. So one question on that, was REI or Ride the Ducks, let me rephrase that, did Ride the Ducks know about our previous recommendations on canopies and side curtains before this sinking occurred?
Member Hamady, I'll field that question. And yet we believe yes too. And we also understand that the Ride the Ducks fleet were all operating in compliance with the NAVIC. And at the time, Ride the Ducks was part of the industry that helped put together the NAVIC.
And I just want to clarify, I'm not talking about the NAVIC. Did they know about our safety recommendations that these canopies and the side curtains that we had found, they were a danger to passengers and egress?
I think the industry understands that completely, and these types of vessels were inspected to Coast Guard regulations, and the Coast Guard was obviously aware of it as well, and they had met the requirements at the time of the sinking.
Okay. I will yield back to the chairman. I do have additional questions, but my time is up.
Great, thank you very much, Member Hamady. And Member Graham, do you have any additional questions at this point?
Mr. Chairman, I do not have any additional questions. Thank you.
Great. I understand members Chapman and Vice Chairman do not have additional questions, but let me, so I'll go right into this, into a few myself. We will issue recommendations coming out of this as a result of this board meeting. And we are proposing 3 recommendations to Ripley Entertainment. As I understand it, Ripley is not operating any ducks. So why do we intend to issue recommendations to them?
Mr. Chairman, at this time, Ripley Entertainment had voluntarily suspended their operations just after the accident, and they still had the ability to go back into business after the board meeting and after the recommendations. So we don't know for sure if this will happen, but if they do, we want to make sure that they have the ability to pay attention to our recommendations and make changes to their operation.
Okay, that makes sense. Thanks. I met with the Commandant of the Coast Guard last week. We had a telephone chat, and I do know that the Coast Guard, in addition to the MSIB that they've issued, which basically is saying that the canopies need to be removed. I believe that's what it says. Is that correct?
Yes, sir, that's correct.
And here it is right here. Recommendations for duct passenger vessel canopy removal. And, that's what we've been calling for since 2002. So that they're doing that. And that's a pretty firm stance for the United States Coast Guard to come out and make that statement. Another thing they're doing, and Morgan, you and I were on a phone call with Admiral Timmy, and then of course we were on there with the Commandant as well, Commandant Schultz. Another thing they're doing, and if you can fill in the blanks here, they're ensuring that their inspection workforce is properly aligned. And there's another thing too, dealing with smart analysis of data. Can you talk about that for a moment, Mr. Terrell?
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, in our conversations with the Coast Guard about this incident in particular and the Conception dive boat fire in California last year, the Admiral in charge of prevention, Admiral Timmy, has started a task force within the Coast Guard prevention section to look at all the data to concentrate on small passenger vessel safety, to bring some analytical tools, such as smart or AI, artificial intelligence, to query the data and look for areas to concentrate upon. They're also looking at areas to improve their workforce on training, any other requirements that the Coast Guard inspectors need. There's also an emphasis on safety management systems. They issued another MSIB, similar to the one you showed, in February of this year, which was a policy message to industry that safety management systems is recommended on small passenger vessels, and they provided the industry with some tools to create a safety management system within operations that would include some of the things Mr. Muse mentioned: accountability, auditing, and so on. So the Coast Guard is taking a industry approach to small passenger vessels. We expect some of these issues will be brought up in the Conception dive boat fire report, which staff is working on. So the Coast Guard is on board. Like you mentioned, from the Commandant all the way down to staff, they are concentrating on these issues.
Well, great. I know that we certainly appreciate their focus on small passenger vessels. I failed to reset my timer when I started talking, so if my colleagues will indulge, if I have run over, I appreciate it. I just have two other things I'd like to say, and then I'll move on. But I do want to point out that we have a recommendation. And by the way, I remember how many you're probably timing me like a hawk. Have I exceeded my time? Does anybody know?
I only time myself.
Yeah, well,
so you're the chairman. You get your time.
Well,
you're fine, Mr. Chairman. You have at least a minute left.
Okay, good. Thanks very much. I've got this huge timer over here, which I forgot to reset. We have recommendation M0005, which in the report, we've indicated that it's closed unacceptable action, but we issued that to 30 duck operators. And, but in fact, Ride the Ducks, we have closed that as closed acceptable alternate action. So I think out of fairness, we need to denote that Ride the Ducks for that it was closed acceptably in an acceptable fashion. Right now, it's indicating in the report that it was closed unacceptable because approximately half of the recommendation recipients did not respond to us or didn't respond appropriately. But does staff agree that we can add a footnote to indicate that Ride the Ducks, in fact, was closed as alternate acceptable action?
Yes, sir. We understood that, and we will update the report accordingly.
Yeah, thanks. And another thing too, since the Coast Guard just replied with the MSIB last week, and they replied officially last week to our recommendations that we issued in November. Will we update the report to indicate the verbiage that we've actually received indications of responses from them?
Yes, sir. Absolutely, we will. Thank you.
Thank you. I have no further questions. Member Hamady.
Thank you. I want to, I spoke with Admiral Timmy from the Coast Guard last week, as I'm sure as the other members did as well, and Captain Neubauer was also on the phone, and I appreciate their time, their attention to these safety issues and to addressing them and taking them so seriously. With that, I do want to highlight our past recommendations on safety management systems for small passenger vessels. In October 2003, a Staten Island ferry had collided with a maintenance pier. 11 passengers died, 70 were injured, and as a result of that tragedy, we recommended that the Coast Guard seek legislative authority to require U.S. flag ferry operators to implement an SMS, and what's obtained require them to actually implement it. That was not accomplished. And then in May 2010, the same ferry collided with the St. George terminal at Staten Island. We investigated that, and 50 people were injured, 3 of them seriously. Our recommendation at that point was expanded for SMS for all operators of U.S. flag passenger vessels. A year later, Congress took action, and in the Coast Guard Authorization Act of 2010, Section 610, they gave the Coast Guard authority to require SMS of small passenger vessels. And 2 years later, and actually 6 years ago tomorrow, the Coast Guard wrote the NTSB saying that they agreed with our recommendation and that they were developing regulations for SMS for all U.S. flag passenger vessels. Unfortunately, for whatever reason, that never occurred. And so no further action was taken, and we reclassified the recommendation in an open, unacceptable status. But then last year, we held a board meeting on the Island Lady, where we reiterated the recommendation to the Coast Guard for SMS for small passenger vessels. And so in that accident, 14 were injured and 1 died. So, and we did discuss this on the phone, and I understand there was an MSIB where the Coast Guard recommended action on SMS, but when do we get past recommendations to actually require SMS of small passenger vessels? This was brought up on our conference call last week, and I wanted to give you, Mr. Young or Mr. Terrell, a second to talk about what you understand the Coast Guard's actions going forward will be on SMS for small passenger vessels.
I think that would be directed by our office director, and I'm sure he will reiterate the letter that came out from the Coast Guard in February of this year.
Yes, Member Hamady and Brian, that's correct. So the Coast Guard, after Admiral Timmy came in, just shortly before the Conception dive boat fire that you went to, Admiral Timmy began his tenure in his position in charge of prevention. He has made it part of his platform for the next year. His term ends in 2021 to concentrate on small passenger vessels, and SMS is one of the 3 planks, like I mentioned, of his plan. In particular, the MSIB they issued in February this year should be viewed as a signal to industry that the Coast Guard is moving forward on the implementation of SMS, and they're providing the tools. I think industry should take that as a clear signal that small passenger vessel regulations are coming. We encourage that. We've been asking for it for a very long time, and I think the accidents we've highlighted over the years, including the Island Lady, would be substantially impacted if we had SMS in place. We've seen success in other industry sectors, and we believe that SMS is really important to improve safety.
Great, thank you very much. I appreciate that, and I do really appreciate all the work that Admiral Timmy is doing and the rest of the Coast Guard, and appreciate our relationship with them. So with that, I have no further questions, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Member Hamady. Do any of my colleagues have additional questions? Okay, let me ask you this. I propose we take a break, but how many would you, not that we need to vote on it, how many of you would like to take a break? No, we're good?
Either
Okay.
way, yeah.
All right, well, if that's the case, staff's okay, Brian? Everybody okay on staff as far as you can tell? We'll just push through?
Yes, sir.
Okay, good, thanks. Ms. Bryson, in just a moment, I'm going to ask, well, I'll ask you to read the proposed findings. Before you do that, I know that you and I had a conversation last night about finding number 17. So if you'd like to just go ahead and clarify that the verbiage there is correct before you start reading it. But I'm going to turn it over to you, Ms. Bryson, to read the proposed findings.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We did, in fact, have a conversation last night about the terminology, rivers, routes. I wanted to make sure that we had captured that correctly. And in fact, that is the correct nomenclature for that particular recommendation. As a result,
finding, yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, for finding 17.
For
right.
finding number 17, correct.
Should read rivers, routes. So,
Correct.
okay, so it is correct in the book. Thank you.
It is correct in the report and also in the findings.
Thank you. It's all yours.
As a result of this investigation, staff proposes 19 findings. Finding number 1, the stretch duct 7's propulsion, steering, and bilge systems operated normally and thus were not factors in this accident. Neither alcohol nor other impairing drugs were factors in this accident, finding number 2. Finding number 3, on the day of the accident, the National Weather Service accurately forecasted and issued timely notifications of a severe thunderstorm that would impact the accident location. Finding number 4, Ride the Ducks did not effectively use all available weather information to monitor the approaching severe weather and assess the risk it posed to its waterborne operations. Number 5, Ride the Ducks should have suspended waterborne operations for the Stretch Duck 7 and the other last tours of the day in anticipation of imminent severe weather. Finding number 6, Ride the Ducks should have had specific guidance for the operations team to determine when to suspend waterborne operations due to approaching severe weather, parentheses, a go, no-go policy. Finding number 7, it is likely that the captain believed he could safely complete the waterborne portion of the tour before the thunderstorm arrived. Number 8, the captain's decision to head toward the exit ramp when encountering the severe weather was appropriate. Finding number 9, initial water ingress to the Stretch Duck 7 was likely from waves rolling over the air intake hatch's spring-loaded damper and intermittently opening it, thereby allowing water into the engine compartment. Finding number 10, the rapid sinking of the Stretch Duck 7 resulted from uncontrolled progressive flooding due to a lack of subdivision. Finding 11, had the Coast Guard implemented safety recommendation M-02-1 to require sufficient reserve buoyancy through passive means, the Stretch Duck 7 likely would not have sunk. Finding number 12, the Stretch Duck 54 was able to exit the lake while exposed to the same conditions as the Stretch Duck 7 due to the increased freeboard, greater reserve buoyancy, and a secureable bow hatch that prevented the ingress of water. Finding 13, when the vessel sank, the closed starboard side curtain aboard the Stretch Duck 7 impeded egress and likely resulted in additional fatalities. Finding number 14, donning life jackets on the Stretch Duck 7 while fitted with an overhead canopy would have created an impediment to escape would have increased the risk of persons being entrapped and could have resulted in additional fatalities. Finding number 15, the actions of the crew and passengers aboard the showboat Branson Belle prevented more fatalities. Finding 16, the response by emergency services was timely and effective. Finding number 17, improved training is needed for small passenger vessel operators on rivers, routes to recognize and better understand weather conditions. Finding 18, navigation and vessel inspection circular, parentheses NVIC 1-01, did not effectively address the NTSB's 2002 recommendation M02-2 to require the removal of or the Coast Guard's approval of fixed canopies and consequently likely increase the number of fatalities. And finding 19, navigation and vessel inspection circular NVIC 101 does not account for circumstances found in the Stretch Duck 7 accident, including operations during approaching severe weather and emergency egress during rapid sinking, and should be updated to provide guidance accordingly.
Thank you very much, Ms. Bryson. At this time, we'll do a roll call to ensure that we're prepared to deliberate. And as we do so, it'll give us a moment to pin each of us on our screens if we so desire. Vice Chairman Landsberg.
The Vice Chairman is ready to vote, sir. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Member Homendy.
Member Homendy's here.
Member Graham.
Member Graham's here and ready.
All right. I'm going to pin you up there, and you're there. And Member Chapman.
And Member Chapman is present, Mr. Chairman.
Great, thank you. I see you all on the screen, and so thank you very much. Are there any proposed amendments to the findings? Seeing none, is there a motion to adopt the findings as presented?
Vice Chairman so moves.
Vice Chairman so moves. Is there a second?
Member Homendy seconds.
Member Homendy seconds. It's been moved and seconded to adopt the findings as presented. Is there any discussion? Seeing none, we will do a roll call vote. We will proceed to a roll call vote. Those in favor of the motion will vote aye. Those opposed will vote nay. Vice Chairman Landsberg.
Vice Chairman votes aye.
Vice Chairman votes aye. Member Homendy.
Member Homendy votes aye.
Member Homendy votes aye. Member Graham.
Member Graham votes aye.
Member Graham votes aye. Member Chapman.
And Member Chapman votes aye.
Member Chapman votes aye. The chairman votes aye. The findings have been adopted unanimously. Ms. Bryson, if you'd please read the proposed probable cause.
Yes, sir. Staff proposes the following probable cause. The National Transportation Safety Board determines that the probable cause of the sinking of the amphibious passenger vessel Stretch Duck 7 was the continued operation of waterborne tours by Ripley Entertainment, Inc., doing business as Ride the Ducks of Branson, after a severe thunderstorm warning was issued for the Table Rock Lake, exposing the vessel to a derecho, which resulted in waves flooding through a non-weather-tight air intake hatch on the bow. Contributing to the sinking was the Coast Guard's failure to require sufficient reserve buoyancy in amphibious vessels. Contributing to the loss of life was the Coast Guard's ineffective action to address emergency egress on amphibious passenger vessels with fixed canopies, such as the Stretch Duck 7, which impeded passenger escape.
Thank you very much. Was that read verbatim? I just want to make sure that was read as it was presented in the draft report.
I I believe I did, yes.
Yeah, no, I'm just asking my colleagues if they heard any discrepancy. I just wanted to make sure. Okay, good. Is there a motion to adopt the probable cause as presented?
Member Graham so moves.
Member Graham so moves. Is there a second?
Vice
Member
Chairman
Chapman
seconds.
Okay, Member Chapman seconds. It's been moved and seconded to adopt the probable cause as presented. Any discussion?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I hate to ask this. Can we do one more reading of the probable cause?
Yeah, I wasn't sure about that.
I'm sorry I interrupted this far away, if you don't mind.
No, it sounded to me like something was out of order, and that's why I asked. I'm trying to do about 3 different things at one time here, but
Yeah.
let me, Ms. Bryson, I'm sorry to ask you to do this, but let's pull that motion off. Let's read it one more time to make sure.
Okay. Staff proposes the following probable cause. The National Transportation Safety Board determines that the probable cause of the sinking of the amphibious passenger vessel Stretch Duck 7 was the continued operation.
Yeah, and there's where I heard it differently. I'm sorry to interrupt you, Ms. Bryson.
It should say continued operation.
Well, no, it's different in our book. So let me let me read what I have in my book. Is that okay?
Sure.
Member
Yes.
Homendy, are you catching this? That it's okay?
It's different
All right.
at the front versus at the back of the report. Because I'm flipping, the second time I flipped, at the front, it says was the continued operation. In the back, it says continued operation.
Okay, and we saw the same problem in the last board meeting as well. So what I'm reading is page 83 of the report. And again, so I'm going to read the probable cause as it's written on page 83. The National Transportation Safety Board determines that the probable cause of the sinking of the amphibious passenger vessel Stretch Duck 7 was Ripley Entertainment Incorporated, DBA Ride the Ducks of Branson, it's a plural, Ride the Duck of Branson's, plural, continued operation of waterborne tours after a severe thunderstorm warning was issued for Table Rock Lake, exposing the vessel to a derecho which resulted in waves flooding through a non-weather-tight air intake hatch on the bow. Is everybody with me so far?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay. Continued to the sinking, excuse me, I'm sorry. Contributing to the sinking was the Coast Guard's failure to require sufficient reserve buoyancy in amphibious vessels. Contributing to the loss of life was the Coast Guard's ineffective action to address emergency egress on amphibious passenger vessels with fixed canopies, such as Stretch Duck 7, which impeded passenger escape. Does everyone agree that the way I read that is the way that it is on page 83 of the draft report?
Yes.
Yes.
And Member Homendy, thank you for backing me up. I thought I heard that backwards, but again, I'm trying to do a couple of different things. So that is the proposed probable cause. Is there a motion to adopt that, to adopt the probable cause as read by the chairman?
Member Graham so moves.
Member Graham so moves. Is there a second?
Member Chapman seconds.
Member Chapman seconds. Is there any discussion? I'd like to discuss one thing. So this question is to staff. The captain has a statutory responsibility to operate the vessel safely. We've had this discussion one-on-one. I've had it one-on-one with staff. I wouldn't be surprised if my colleagues have had this discussion one-on-one with the staff. Why is the captain not mentioned in the probable cause?
Mr. Chairman, I'll start out by just saying, to start once again, reiterate, is not an excuse, but we definitely had a lack of information due to our inability to discuss the events of the accident with the captain, to determine his course of action, his decision-making, and the events that took place that day. There are several other reasons that staff looked out very closely to ensure that we had the most appropriate information to make this determination. And we'll let our Nautical Operations Group Chairman begin and talk about the decision-making that we understood based on the evidence we saw and the evidence available to the captain on that day.
Mr. Chairman, given that the captain is responsible for the safety of both the vessel and the passengers, we try to understand why he made the decisions he did to enter the lake on that day. What we found was he did not have the information he needed to make any different decision. When he arrived at the lake, from what he could see, the sky was blue. We know from the camera that the lake was calm. We don't believe that he understood the intensity or how fast the storm was moving, and the warning was never communicated to him as what from anybody in management. Additionally, there were 3 other duck boats on the water ahead of him, none of whom communicated any hazard to him, and he entered the lake not even 2 minutes after stretch duck 54, just in front of him. On top of that, without that information, the decision tools that he had were not adequate either. He had to base his decision on what the COI said, the operations manual, and the stability letter, all of which he was in compliance with at the time.
We also understand from statements that the captain said is that the lake erupted and he had never seen the lake get that rough that fast. So although he indicated in a state police interview that he had looked at the radar, we don't know the intensity of the storm or what he perceived to be the severity of that storm.
Well, and thank you. But I mean, I heard earlier that he did not have the information. Was the information ambiguous? Did he not look? That's what I want to know. I mean, he has the legal responsibility to make sure that he has that information before he begins a voyage.
And we believe the people who have the information available, who have the weather service at their disposal in the headquarters, are giving him the information to depart the facility. And we don't know how the weather was interpreted or if it was seen after the warning came through. We know for a fact it wasn't transmitted to the captain, and he did not have the ability to hear that information on the vehicle after he had departed the dock.
Okay, I've got the timeline here. So yeah, he departed the weather. The severe thunderstorm warning was issued at 1832. He departed the dock, stretched the duck dock, which is just an office. It's not a dock at all. That it departed 1 minute later. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. And I do think this graph that we have put in the report tells the story. Not only did the Stretch Duck 7 captain enter the lake after the warning went out, but it's very obvious that 3 other boats did the same thing. He watched the 54 leave 1 minute and 50 seconds prior to his entrance into the lake. You have 4 boats with 4 different captains on the lake after the warning was sent out from the National Weather Service. This isn't a single problem with a single individual. This is a systemic problem with the company as a whole, advising their fleet of an issue that comes to their attention via the National Weather Service. Staff feels that this is this red zone here where the severe thunderstorm warning was issued indicates that nobody was aware of that weather warning on the water or on the road.
Thank you. I'd love to hear from my colleagues. Vice Chairman Landsberg, do you have any thoughts on this?
I did in fact ask the very same question because as in aviation, the captain is the final authority as to the safe operation of the vehicle. And the whole concept of checks and balances come in, that if you have a single point failure, i.e. the management not saying anything, then you have a secondary source there. One thing that we didn't discuss, and I don't know if I can really add anything at this late hour, but looking at the sky, I find it hard to believe that it just went from blue to black immediately, but be that as it may. I guess we could continue the discussion here as to, what did the captain know? When did he know it? And was he thinking about it? And this goes along to my question earlier in our discussions about the fact that there are severe thunderstorms are not an unusual occurrence in the state of Missouri. And this captain had been on the water for a long time. And to say, well, this is unprecedented, I think goes to some of your earlier comments about, what are the hazards in a severe thunderstorm?
Mr. Young, if you could remove that slide right now, that'd be great. Okay, Member Hamady, your thoughts?
Yeah, I had similar questions for the staff as well, and because it is the statutory responsibility for the master to be in charge and make those decisions. But it was clear to me, while everyone knew there was a severe thunderstorm watch, it was the warning that came at 6:32, and at the time, Stretch Duck 7 was on the road, and 23 minutes later entered the water. And there was time for those that were monitoring weather to call on the tour itself. The captain did not have any other information other than a radio back and forth between the duck dock, which, as you said, was an office building, and then what he could see as he approached the lake, as well as the other 3 captains that also chose to go on the lake. So I was satisfied with staff's explanation of that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I appreciate your perspective. Member Graham.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I agree a lot with what the Vice Chairman said about ultimately it's the captain's responsibility. But I appreciate the comments from staff and the in-depthness of their investigation into this, with the lack of being able to interview key people, as in the captain and the general manager and stuff. But the policy of not using the cell phone while on the tour, I guess, there's an argument there that maybe he wasn't on the water, he could have checked it on the ride over. But the underlying fact to me that the management did not pass on the weather information really knocked this one out of the park for me. That I just can't understand that, and so I am perfectly comfortable with the probable cause the way it is now.
Thank you very much. Member Chapman.
Member Chapman also agrees with the probable cause. I think you've raised an important question about the role of the captain, and I certainly don't suggest that the actions and the responsibility of the captain are diminished in any way. But the staff has made a very good case here, I think, that in terms of the probable cause of the accident, it was a systemic issue, not the actions, not the individual actions of the captain that resulted in the accident.
Thank you very much. This is something that I've gone back and forth on. A week ago, I was thinking that the captain should be a part of the probable cause. But after going back and looking at the facts very carefully, I'm of the camp that the probable cause as presented is accurate. Let's look at the facts. Yes, the captain, and we've all said this, but yes, the captain does have the statutory authority for the safe operation of the vessel. There's no denying that. However, You can't know what you don't know. He was aware that there was weather approaching. He did know that. But as we saw a still picture of it today, and then I saw a video of it yesterday, that once that duck, when the duck was getting ready to launch, and when it did launch, it was glassy smooth on that lake. And this is what the vice chairman said. What did he know and when did he know it? And so I am comfortable with the probable cause as stated. So that's where we are. Any further discussion on this? Okay, it's been moved and seconded that we adopt the probable cause as presented. As I understand it, there's no further discussion. However, if you'd like to speak up now, I'm looking at each of you. So if you have anything to say, let me know. And would staff like to elaborate any further on this before we actually take the vote?
No, sir. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. It's been moved and seconded to adopt the probable cause as presented. We'll now proceed to a roll call vote. Vice Chairman Landsberg.
The vice chairman votes aye.
Member Homedy.
Member Homendy votes aye.
Member Graham.
Member Graham votes aye.
Member Chapman.
Member Chapman votes aye.
Chairman votes aye. The probable cause has been adopted unanimously. Ms. Bryson, if you'd please read the proposed recommendations.
Yes, sir. As a result of its investigation, the National Transportation Safety Board makes the following 6 new safety recommendations. There are 3 to the U.S. Coast Guard. 1, require that amphibious passenger vessels equipped with forward hatches enable operators to securely close them during waterborne operations to prevent water ingress. Number 2, review the circumstances of the Stretch Duck 7 sinking and other amphibious passenger vessel accidents and revise Navigation and Vessel Inspection Circular NVIC 1-01 to address the issues found in these accidents, including operations during imminent severe weather and emergency egress during rapid sinking. Number 3, examine existing training and knowledge requirements for understanding and applying fundamental weather principles to waterborne operations for Coast Guard credentialed masters who operate small passenger vessels, and if warranted, require additional training for these ratings on recognition of critical weather situations in pre-departure planning and while underway. There are 3 to Ripley Entertainment, Inc., doing business as Ride the Ducks. Recommendation number 4, using the operating restrictions found in vessel certificates of inspection, review and revise your current operating policy to provide specific guidance on vessel operations when adverse conditions could be encountered during any part of the waterborne tour by implementing a go, no-go policy. Recommendation number 5, modify spring-loaded forward hatches of modified DUKW amphibious passenger vessels to enable their closure during waterborne operations as a prevention for water ingress. Number 6, reevaluate emergency procedures regarding the donning of life jackets aboard modified DUKW amphibious passenger vessels when equipped with fixed canopies. There are 2 previously issued recommendations that the board has previously voted on. Would you like me to read those or would you like me to hold?
It's a good question. Customary, I think we would include those as well. Is that what we do as custom? I believe so. Member Homedy is nodding her head, and I believe that's correct. Vice Chairman is as well. If you don't mind, please proceed.
I'm prepared to do it. I just didn't want to confuse things.
Thank
Previously issued recommendations. As a result of its investigation of this accident in November of 2019, the National Transportation Safety Board issued the following 2 safety recommendations, which currently are classified as open await response. To the United States Coast Guard, to the U.S. Coast Guard, recommendation number 1, which is M19-15, required DUKW amphibious passenger vessels, parentheses, commonly referred to as original and/or stretch DUKWs, to have sufficient reserve buoyancy through passive means so that they remain upright and afloat with a full complement of passengers and crew members in the event of damage or flooding. The second recommendation, which is M1916, for DUKW amphibious passenger vessels without sufficient reserve buoyancy, parentheses, commonly referred to as original and/or stretch DUKWs, require the removal of canopies, side curtains, and their associated framing during waterborne operations to improve emergency egress in the event of a sinking. That concludes the recommendations.
Thank you, Ms. Bryson. And Member Hamady, you have a question, I think, and it's probably the same one I have, but go right ahead.
Ms. Bryson, could you reiterate, can you read the third recommendation? It's the third recommendation, right? The third recommendation to the U.S. Coast Guard one more time.
Let me make sure I'm getting the right one. Examine existing training and knowledge requirements for understanding and applying fundamental weather principles to waterborne operations for Coast Guard credentialed masters who operate small passenger vessels, and if warranted, require additional training requirements for these ratings on recognition of critical weather situations in pre-departure planning and while underway.
Thank you very much. That's what I have.
Okay, thank you. The question I have, and I think I asked this question earlier, but it's not clear in my mind at this point. So for the previously issued recommendations to the Coast Guard, 1915 and M1916, now that we've heard from the Coast Guard, currently is classified as open await response. So how will, Mr. Marcus, how will we handle that in the report?
The actual classification of that is open initial response received. That's essentially an administrative difference. It doesn't require a board vote, but the report should probably be updated to reflect the initial response received due to the just recently submitted Coast Guard response. Okay.
And so that does not require a vote. If it does, we can amend it right now. We can do that. I mean, if it requires a vote, let's amend it now. If not, then we can just move on. But you're under the impression that I was thinking that how do we traditionally do that? When you say we don't need a vote?
But when a recommendation is issued, it is automatically classified as open await response. The board may, under unusual circumstances, give it an initial classification, but if nothing is done, it is issued as open await response. When we receive the initial letter from the recipient, again, without a board vote, it is changed to open initial response received. And then when the board votes to classify it, that's when it changes. But I would say that since you are approving the report, it would be best to amend what is going into the report to say that it's initial response received. That is sometimes an issue with the recipient organizations, because if you say open await response, it looks like they haven't done anything, when in fact they have submitted something, and the initial response received conveys the message that we have it, but we haven't yet had a chance to evaluate it.
Yes, I agree. And so it ought to be changed here as well as in the main body of the report where we reference those recommendations. So I will entertain a motion to amend this verbiage on page 86 to say which is currently classified as open initial response received. If that's the way it would be, Jeff, is that correct?
That's correct.
I'll
For both
entertain
recommendations.
such a motion. I'm sorry.
For both recommendations, yes.
That is correct. You're correct. So both 19-M1915 and M19-16 would be classified as open initial response received. I'll entertain a motion for that.
Vice Chairman, so moves.
Member
Okay.
Chapman, seconds.
Thank you. The Vice Chairman has moved and Member Chapman has seconded. Is there any discussion or any questions about that? I want to make sure it's clear. Okay. Any further discussion? It's been moved and seconded to adopt to amend to reclassify recommendation M1915 and M1916 to reclassify that as open initial response received. Is there a it's been moved and seconded. We'll proceed to a roll call vote strictly on those, and then we'll come back and vote on the recommendations altogether. So let's take a roll call vote on 1915 and 1916. Vice Chairman Landsberg.
Vice Chairman votes aye.
Vice Chairman votes aye. Member Homendy.
Member Homendy votes aye.
Member Homendy votes aye. Member Graham.
Member Graham votes aye.
Member Graham votes aye. Member Chapman.
Member Chapman votes aye.
Member Chapman votes aye. The chairman votes aye. So 1915 and 1916 have both been reclassified as open initial response received. That was unanimous. I'll entertain a motion to, or are there any amendments to the recommendations 1 through 6? Recommendations 1 through 6, the new recommendations. Seeing no amendments to those, is there a motion to adopt the recommendations as presented?
Member Homendy so moves.
Thank you, Member Homendy. She so moves. Is there a second?
Member Graham seconds.
Member Graham seconds. Any discussion on the recommendations? Seeing none, all in favor of adopting the recommendations, the new recommendations as presented, please, we will proceed to a roll call vote. Vice Chairman Landsberg.
Vice Chairman votes aye.
Vice Chairman votes aye. Member Homendy.
Member Homendy votes aye.
Member Homendy votes aye. Member Graham.
Member Graham votes aye.
Member Graham votes aye. Member Chapman.
Member Chapman votes aye.
Member Chapman votes aye. Chairman votes aye. Recommendations have been voted, have been approved unanimously. Does anyone have any additional issues related to this report that they wish to discuss? Okay, is there a motion to adopt the report as revised?
Vice Chairman so moves.
Vice Chairman so moves. Is there a second?
Member Homendy seconds.
Member Homendy seconds. It's been moved and seconded to adopt the final report. Is there any discussion? Seeing none, all in favor of adopting the final report as amended, as we just amended it a second ago on those two recommendations. All in favor of adopting the report as amended, please signal. We'll proceed to a roll call vote. Vice Chairman Landsberg.
Vice Chairman votes aye.
Vice Chairman votes aye. Member Homendy.
Member Homendy votes aye.
Member Homendy votes aye. Member Graham.
Member Graham votes aye.
Member Graham votes aye. Member Chapman.
Member Chapman votes aye.
Member Chapman votes aye. Chairman votes aye. The final report has been adopted as amended. Do any members wish to reserve the right to file a concurring or dissenting statement?
The Vice Chairman would like to file a concurring statement.
Okay, the Vice Chairman reserves that right for concurring. Any others? Okay, thank you. Now proceed to the As we prepare to wrap it up, those participating in the board meeting, members and staff, if you like, you may turn off your cameras and your mics. In closing, I want to thank my colleagues for their good preparation in going into this board meeting and for the good discussions, good debate, good questions during the board meeting. Our special thanks goes to the Office of Marine Safety, in particular, the investigator in charge, Brian Young. But I always say that nothing here at the board happens through just one person. It is truly a group effort. A sincere thank you goes to the program and support staff who work behind the scenes to make all of this possible. That goes double for the first ever virtual board meeting conducted by the National Transportation Safety Board. Guys, I think you all did a very good job. This is all new to all of us, but good job. So thank you for your cooperation. But again, special thanks to all of those behind the scenes who work tirelessly to make it, allow it to be pulled off. I'd also like to thank our former colleague, member Earl Wayner, who was the board member on scene. I'd also like to recognize Mr. Jeff Marcus, who today is celebrating his 40th anniversary with the federal government, many years with the NTSB. But Jeff, congratulations. I wish I had your retirement. The recommendations that we issued today, if adopted, will require Ride the Ducks to develop a policy and guide employees on go, no-go decisions for waterborne operations in adverse weather. Today's recommendations also call for the modification of spring-loaded forward hatches of modified duck vessels so that they can be closed securely to prevent flooding. These recommendations complement those we issued to the Coast Guard last November of 19, to require sufficient reserve buoyancy and the removal of canopies, side curtains, and their associated framing during waterborne operations. You know, when I think of amphibious vessels, we certainly think of World War II and the invasion of Normandy on D-Day, June the 6th, 1944. What people don't know, what many people don't know, is the invasion was originally scheduled for June the 5th. The Allies had to wait a day for better weather before they could proceed. Well, if D-Day had to pause for safety, so can recreational tours. We stand adjourned. Thank you very much.